Abandoned World by Julia Huni. Copyright 2019 by Julia Huni. Digitally narrated by PlayHT. Chapter 1. Leaning in close to the camera on my phone, so my eye filled the view area, I yelled my catchphrase, "That was insane." Then I leaned back. Insane vidman out. Tapping the red button, I stopped the recording. My name is Zane Torres. But to hundreds of thousands of fans, I was known as Insane Vidman. My videos went viral almost every week. I'm still not sure what the magic was, but I had it. People loved my stuff. Back in the old days, a top-end VidTuber could get millions of viewers. But with the exodus, there were barely a million people on Earth, all together. I had hoped some of my videos would get delivered to Sally Ride, our new home planet, when the Magellan left the next month, and that millions of viewers would be waiting for more when I arrived 2 years later. It took 10 years to get there, but passengers spent that time in cold sleep. If I could stockpile enough videos, I'd still be relevant 2 years after they arrived, right when I did. I sat back in my chair and uploaded the video to my computer. Taking only a few minutes, I edited the content, cutting out the dead airtime and that false start at the beginning. Then I pressed upload. Nothing happened. Rolling my eyes, I checked the internet status. Out, again. I checked the hardware, but everything on my end was good, so it had to be a system outage. With a sigh, I set the video to upload when the connection went green, then locked the login screen. I didn't need my stepbrother, Dozer, messing with my hardware or accounts. I'd learned that the hard way, months ago. It was late, past curfew, but Dozer wasn't back yet. Dozer wasn't his real name, of course. But he was a weightlifter, really huge, so everyone called him that instead of Paul. That night, he'd gone to an underground concert. He frequently rolled in after hours. Dozer's dad, Howard, didn't care, and my mom had been gone for almost a year. Dozer's mom was an unknown quantity. I had never met the woman, and as far as I knew, she hadn't seen her own son since he was very young. A tap on the window startled me. I peeked through the gap in the curtains, then ripped them open. Starla Everbright blew me a kiss. It should have looked odd with her pack, personal air cleaner, on, but everything Starla did looked amazing. I hadn't expected to see her tonight, and I felt a warm glow in my chest. I gave her my best "Hey, babe, good to see you" smile, winked, and pointed to the door. No one in their right mind would open a window. There was no way to keep the polluted air out. I'd meet her in the lobby, as always. I opened the bedroom door a crack, but the living room was dark. No one on the couch, so Howard must be asleep. Probably drunk. I ghosted through the living room and out the front door. Starla ran up the hall to meet me, throwing her arms around me. I wanted to kiss her, but she pressed her face against the curve of my neck. I reveled in the warmth of her body pressing against mine, and my heart skipped into overdrive. When she pulled away, my neck felt damp and cool. "Are you crying?" Starla pressed her fingers under her eyes and sniffed. Tears started to trickle down her cheeks. She wiped them away, carefully using a tissue to blot without streaking her makeup. Starla was beautiful. Dark eyes with thick eyelashes, perfect lips, wavy, gleaming hair, amazing body with strong arms and legs, and a perfect figure. She'd be beautiful even without her makeup and expensive clothes, but I'd never seen her that way. She ran a very successful beauty channel on VidTube. She never left home without looking perfect. It was an essential part of her brand. That's how we met, at a virtual con for VidTube high-earners. I was one of the top VidTube influencers and Starla headlined their beauty channels. All of them. We'd been on a panel together. The video of our argument had gone viral. Fans shipped us faster than you can click a like button. We stayed in touch after the con, and when I discovered she lived in Washington, D.C., I'd wrangled a trip into the city to meet her. We'd been almost inseparable since. Well, at least when we could get together. Starla lived in the city. Her dad was a big cheese in the government. I lived out in the housing blocks of Maryland. I didn't have a car, and the metro had become unreliable in recent years. So, I lived for those days when Starla came to visit. "Why are you crying?" I asked, trying to pull her back into my arms. She resisted. "I have some bad news," she said, looking away. I wanted to reach out again, but her tone put me on edge. I kept my hands at my sides. "What?" "We're going upstairs tomorrow." She blurted it out in a rush. "I'm so sorry." "What?" I stared at her, my brain spinning. It didn't make sense. "I thought you were going on the next ship." "With me. We're supposed to go together." "I know," Starla's voice broke. "That was the plan. But my dad. Tell him you won't go. You're almost 18. You can decide for yourself. We'll go together, on the Explorer." "I know," she repeated. I told him I wanted to wait. "It's only 2 more years." "Tell him you won't go." I repeated. "You can just stay here with me. Or we can go somewhere else. Together. Just don't go with them." "I have to go." She bit her lip. My eyes narrowed. "There's something else." "What aren't you telling me?" She turned away, rubbing her hands up and down her arms as if she were cold. The temperature-controlled housing blocks stayed at a steady 72 degrees, year-round, so she couldn't be chilled. Daddy." She took a deep breath. "I wasn't supposed to tell you, but Daddy says there won't be another ship." She glanced over her shoulder at me, the tears still shimmering in her eyes. "What do you mean there won't be another ship?" I felt stupid, repeating everything she said. "The Explorer is on its way from Gagarin. It's due here in 2 years, then it takes us to Sally Ride. I've had a billet on the Explorer since I was born. Not to mention the thousands of others with tickets." She blotted her eyes again, punching her shoulders. "I don't know what to tell you, but that's what Daddy said. The Explorer never left Gagarin. The exodus is done. I have to go now, because there won't be another ship." "Wait, what? How can it be done? There are still hundreds of thousands of people here." She stamped her foot. "I told you I don't know. It's just done. This is the last ship." "Then, take me with you." I cried, my chest aching. "There must be room for one more person. Don't go without me." She put her hand on my arm. "You know I'd take you if I could. But Daddy said there's no extra room. We're lucky he got space for us. Most of the people he works with will be left behind. Luckily, he's high enough on the must-survive list." She broke off, as if she'd realized that wasn't a very tactful thing to say. "So, the rest of us don't need to survive? We're expendable?" "I didn't say that. It's Daddy's job. The president is kind of, you know how it is." She squeezed his bicep. "You aren't expendable to me." I stared at her. "But we are to the government. You're saying that I, and everyone else we know, we're being left behind to die. But the government is leaving." "It isn't just the government," Starla said, stung. "There's lots of wealthy people bribing their way onto the passenger list." She clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. I stared at her. "Lots of people bribing, that's not something that happens fast. How long have you known?" What? I just found out. She looked everywhere, unable or unwilling to meet my eyes. You've known all along, as long as we've been together. Her face turned red, so I knew I was right. You always knew you'd be leaving without me. Why did you lie? I wasn't sure, she hedged. I thought there might be room for you. She shook her head. I'm sorry, Zane, but I need to leave. Goodbye. She turned and ran out the door without looking back. Chapter 2. Sitting at the breakfast table the next morning, I listened to the news on my phone while I ate my cereal and full milk. Listeners who live near Dulles Shuttle Port posted about the extra shuttle launches they'd heard that morning. The reporters claimed predicted storms meant the schedule for the next few days would be disrupted, so Exocorp had decided to accelerate the schedule for the morning. Lies, I muttered into my bowl. I hadn't really slept after Starla left. How could I? Not only was my heart broken, but I was probably the only person on the planet who knew he'd been left behind. So far. I'd recorded an angry rant to post to my VidTube channel, but the internet hadn't come back on. But it didn't matter. What good would it do? Even if people believed me, there was nothing anyone could do about it. We were stuck. I'd finally dozed off about 5 in the morning. Now it was after 10, and I felt like I'd been outside breathing unfiltered air all night. Foggy, achy, exhausted. Howard shuffled into the room in his shorts and undershirt. He looked like the mean drunk character from a comedy show. Unfortunately for me, this wasn't a comedy show. My stepdad was the mean drunk. And he stunk. He must have really gone overboard last night. Where's your brother? Howard slammed his mug down on the table, splashing coffee over the side. He didn't seem to notice the hot liquid spilling onto his fingers. I shrugged. Not my business to keep track of the kid. Howard slapped a hand on the table, making my bowl jump. I asked you a question, boy. Where's Dozer? He went out last night. How should I know where he is? Probably got picked up for curfew violation. It wouldn't be the first time. Howard would get the call sometime this morning. Although, they usually called bright and early, waking Howard from his drunken stupor. I usually tried to leave early on days Dozer didn't get home before dawn. Howard would take his rage out on anyone in the vicinity. But this morning I'd been too tired. And too depressed. Smack. Howard's hand slammed into my cheek. Pain exploded through my face and up into my eye. I leapt back, turning my chair over onto the floor. You'd better mend that attitude, boy. Don't you ever forget I give you a home. With your mother gone, ain't no reason I have to do that 'cept the goodness of my heart. He placed one meaty mitt on his chest. You go find my Dozer and bring him home. I ducked away from another smack and grabbed my bag. I never left anything valuable in the house. 2 months after Mom had married this lout, my stuff started disappearing. I wasn't sure if it was Dozer or Howard, or both of them, but I had stopped taking chances. I carried my phone and laptop with me 24/7. I'll check with the cops. I grabbed a pack filter from the dispenser by the door, then paused. Without looking at Howard, I grabbed a couple more and shoved them into my bag. Just in case. I glanced back at my stepfather. We're screwed, you know. The government went upstairs this morning. Everyone still here is going to die on this mud ball. Howard glared at me, his bloodshot eyes dull and uncomprehending. I don't know what game you're playing, but shut up. Go find your brother. Step-brother, I growled, slamming the door behind me. I checked the local police station, but they hadn't picked Dozer up that night. We'll call his guardian if we find him, the tired woman said. That's the law. I thought about telling her the law was pointless, that there was no one to create or enforce them anymore. But my head pounded too loudly to care. I checked 2 other police stations, in case Dozer had traveled farther away than usual, but none of them had a 16-year-old delinquent in custody. Then my phone pinged. It was a message from Dozer. That was odd. Dozer never texted me. We tolerated each other, but we weren't friends. He was probably in trouble and wanted me to bail him out. Don't bother looking for me, I'm upstairs. Good luck, sucker. Yeah, right. Howard is pissed. Get home. The phone pinged again. This time, it was a picture. A picture of Dozer standing in front of the shuttle launch departure gate, with his arm around Starla. I laughed. It was the best fake I'd ever seen. It even had a date stamp. That little creep. Who knew he could even turn on a computer, much less use photo manipulation software? Dozer must have unplumbed depths. Very funny, go home. Howard is really pissed. The phone pinged again, but this time it was from Starla. I wasn't going to tell you, but if you won't believe him. The message was followed by a bunch of heart and smiley face emojis. In the same picture. Chapter 3. How could I have been so stupid? So oblivious? What could she possibly see in that cretin? Sure, he was big for his age, and had lots of wavy blonde hair the girls all seemed to love. And he pumped iron all the time, so he was huge and ripped. But Dozer was an idiot. And almost 2 years younger than Starla. When had they spent any time together? It didn't hit me until later that she had lied about having an extra ticket. Broken and hurting, I went to my favorite place, Dragon Dojon. The studio was a long walk from the police station, but I couldn't stomach going back to Howard. The door chimed softly as I pushed it open. Taking in a deep breath of the sweat and incense-tinged air, my shoulders automatically relaxed a fraction. I pulled off my shoes at the door and crossed the lobby to the locker room. Stashing my bag inside my locker, I changed into my dobok, locked the door and entered the inner room. Master Stevens sat in the center of the mat, his eyes closed, back straight, legs crossed. I waited in silence while the master completed his meditation. When Master Stevens' eyes opened, I bowed. Greetings, Sabonim. Stevens rose effortlessly to his feet and bowed in return. Greetings, Zane. We don't have a lesson scheduled today, do we? I shook my head. No, but can we spar? Stevens narrowed his eyes. I think maybe you should work out instead. You don't look emotionally balanced enough to spar. Anger flared through me like a jolt of electricity, followed immediately by the realization that the master was correct. I bowed again, removed my dobok jacket, and took my frustration out on the workout equipment. 40 minutes later, I stopped for a water break. My hair and t-shirt dripped sweat. Master Stevens handed me a bottle of water and a towel. Come sit down and tell me why you're so angry. We sat on a pair of exercise balls Stevens had bounced onto the mat. Starting with Starla's visit last night, I laid the whole story out for Stevens. I took another swig from the bottle. I don't know if that workout helped at all. I can't believe how stupid I've been. I should have realized Starla was into Dozer. When they first met, she kept asking me about him. And now that I know, I look back, every time he was gone, she couldn't come over. I shook my head and hurled the empty water bottle across the room. Then I remembered where I was. Sorry, Master Stevens. I jumped up to retrieve the water bottle. Setting it down by the door, I dropped into the push-up position. Stop that, Stevens said. You have every right to be angry. I looked up. But I'm supposed to control my anger. You taught me that. Stevens's lips twisted. Sometimes you have to let go a little. Throwing an empty plastic bottle across a room is pretty mild. I might join you. The government is gone, you say? Things are going to get ugly. Really fast. I rolled to my feet and met Stevens' eyes. Yes, sir. I need to make a plan. I'm not going back to Howard's place. If the government is gone, then there won't be any monthly support coming anymore. He's going to kick me out if I can't pay my way. This is going to be bad for everyone. Stevens stroked his chin, staring off into the distance. I've read enough early 21st century post-apocalyptic novels to know. Clean air is provided by the government. Food is processed by private companies, but they're paid by the government to distribute it. Electricity, water, garbage, sewer. It's all going to stop. We need to get out of the city, now. Do you have family, sir? I asked. I couldn't believe I didn't know the answer to that question. I'd been taking classes from Stevens for 5 years, in exchange for cleaning the dojon after classes. After I'd proven myself trustworthy, he let me do the books for the business. But we'd never talked much about my home life, and I never asked about Stevens. No, they're gone. The older man stood and carefully put the exercise ball into the rack. My wife, Rietta, died 10 years ago. My son and his partner went upstairs a couple years ago. I could have gone, but I figure I've only got another 20 years. I'd rather stay here. 20 years? I blurted out. How old are you? Then I blushed. Stevens smiled. I'm 73. I know, I only look 50-ish. Good genes. But it looks like I won't make it to 90, unless we come up with a plan. Do you have anything you need to get at home? I shook my head. Got it all with me. I can't risk leaving anything at home with Howard. It disappears into a bottle. Clothes? Stevens asked. Yeah, I guess I should get those. I rolled my eyes at my stupidity. Don't worry about it. We'll swing by your place on the way out of town. Out of town? Where are we going? Stevens smiled. I have a friend who's a prepper. We're headed to Tennessee. Stevens pulled his car around to the back door of the dojon. No sense in alerting the neighborhood. We moved a couple cases of snacks and water into the trunk, as well as a case of pack filters. These things are going to be worth their weight in gold pretty soon, Stevens predicted, tapping the box. He locked the back door of the dojon, then stared at it for a few minutes. The swirling dragon logo had faded over the years, but the name, Dragon Martial Arts, stood out bright and clean. Stevens reached up and caressed the red paint. We had a good 10 years, he whispered. We drove to Stevens' apartment. Parking in the basement of the housing block, Stevens climbed out of the car and locked it. We don't want to attract attention, so we need to do this as efficiently as possible. Grab that hand truck. He pointed at a device in the corner. It was stored in the basement to make deliveries faster for the distribution companies. It has a password lock on it, I said. Stevens looked at me, his lips twitching. Yeah, I can hack it. I pulled out my phone and typed in a few commands. Holding it over the release plate, I tapped a button. The metal arm holding the hand truck to the wall popped open. How'd you know? I asked as I pulled the wheeled cart to the elevator. I've seen your VidTube channel. Stevens raised an eyebrow. Did you think I wouldn't check you out before letting you cook my books? If you knew, why'd you let me anywhere near your computer? I pushed the cart into the elevator behind Stevens. Stevens smiled. I trust you. You have a good heart, and I've seen your integrity. I'd like to think I've helped improve it a little, too. I ducked my head. Yeah, you've done a lot for me. I stood there in awkward silence, thinking of the times I'd slept on the mat at the dojon because I couldn't face Howard's drunken state or my mom's empty chair. On the 4th floor, we got out and trundled the hand truck down the hallway. Stevens opened the apartment and ushered me inside. It was tidy, no dirty dishes in the sink or abandoned clothing on the floor. A couple pale plants stretched their spindly branches toward the windows. It was hard to grow anything in the smog-covered city. Grab the ice chest from that closet. Stevens pointed behind the front door. Take anything in the fridge, but only grab stuff from the freezer if you think we can use it before it goes bad. If you're hungry, eat anything that won't keep. No point in letting it go to waste. I popped open the freezer. Frozen vegetables? Nope. Frozen protein patties? Will we be able to heat stuff up on the road? These burgers could work for dinner tonight, but I don't think they'll keep much longer. Stevens glanced up from the canned food he was loading into a box. Bring anything you think we can eat in the next 2 days. I have a camp stove, so we can cook if we need to. You got any spoons? I asked, holding up a container of vanilla ice cream. I don't want this to melt all over the floor. I grinned. Top left drawer, Stevens said. Grab one for me, too. I pulled spoons from the drawer and scooped half the ice cream into a bowl. I squirted on some chocolate sauce and handed it to Stevens. Then I poured sauce into the open container. I scooped up a huge mouthful and let it melt on my tongue. You have some pretty unhealthy stuff in here, Master. I thought you only ate kale and tofu. Stevens dug into his bowl. A man's gotta have some vices. Ice cream is better than tobacco or drugs. He shoved a huge scoop into his mouth, then put the spoon down to continue loading the box. We loaded up the protein patties, some bagged frozen fruit, half a container of full milk and all the fresh fruits and vegetables. Leave the condiments, Stevens said. I'll throw some spices into this box, and I have some packets of mayo and mustard. Those things keep forever. Once the kitchen was packed, we moved to the bedrooms. Stevens tossed a couple duffel bags to me. Pack up the clothes. I don't have a lot, but they should fit both of us. Put everything you can squeeze in. Grab me another pair of shoes, those hiking boots in the closet. If they'll fit you, grab a pair for yourself, too. I'm working on the books. He opened the second bedroom and took a box inside. I packed up all the clothing the master owned, but the second duffel was still only half full. I added a couple blankets and stacked 2 pillows on top. Leaving those bags in the living room, I moved on to the bathroom. A small box for toiletries filled quickly. Stevens was a bit of a hoarder when it came to bathroom stuff. Green apple body wash? I glanced through the door into the bedroom. Stevens looked up from the box he was packing. The walls behind him were covered by full-height bookshelves, each of them stacked to bursting with books. 2 full boxes lay beside the martial artist, and he stood over a third, a book in each hand. What do you think? Comprehensive gardening or how everything works? I guess it depends on what you plan to do with them. I scratched my head. Do you know how to garden? Good call, Stevens said, dropping the gardening book on a tipsy pile. That one's old anyway. With the climate changes, lots of those techniques don't work anymore. And Leah has been growing her own food for years. What do you got there? I grinned, waggling the bottle. Just admiring your taste in toiletries. Stevens grinned back, then a shadow flickered across his face. That was my wife's. She stocked up on a lot of stuff before she died. I haven't had to buy shampoo in over a decade. Take anything you think might be useful. Look for trade items, too, not just useful to us. He went back to the shelf for another book. Trade items? I went back into the bathroom. I supposed unopened toiletries might be useful. I threw a wrapped stack of soap and 4 unopened bottles of shampoo into the box. Then I hit the motherlode. Stevens had row upon row of over-the-counter medicines. Pain relievers, allergy meds, digestion aids, antibacterial creams and ointments. A huge bag of Epsom salts. I put that into a second box. When they were full, I lugged the boxes out to the hand truck. Stevens stood by the door, his 3 boxes of books precariously stacked on top of the ice chest and the box of canned foods. He looked at the 2 boxes in my arms and sighed. I was afraid of that. We might have to leave one of these behind. Good thing I sorted by usefulness. He set the top box on the kitchen counter and gestured for me to stack my boxes on top of the books. Ooh, good call. He nodded, pointing at the bandages. Can't we take a second load? I asked. If it will fit in the car, Stevens said. Let's go. He rolled the hand truck out the door, and I followed behind with the 2 duffel bags. Oh, wait one. Stevens darted back into the apartment. I waited, hoping none of the neighbors would come out and demand to know what I was doing. People in the housing blocks knew each other, and I was a stranger. A few minutes later, Stevens reappeared, a small but heavy bag in his hand. Had to get the stash, he whispered. He tucked the bag into the top box and rolled the hand truck down the hall. We made it to the elevator without a single neighbor sticking their head out into the hallway. That's odd, Stevens said. Usually, old Mrs. Harriman wants to know everyone's business. Maybe she went upstairs, I said, bitterly. Stevens shook his head. No, she's older than I am. Maybe she took off, too. Check the news, we'll see if anyone else is bolting. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. No signal. Probably the elevator shaft. I'll wait till we're on the move. We loaded the car, barely fitting the last box of books into the tiny back seat. I'd love to go back for that third one, Stevens said, ruefully. But I don't suppose you'd appreciate a box of books under your legs all the way to Tennessee. If they're important. I didn't want to be crowded for 500 miles, but if Stevens was right, having the right supplies and information could be critical to our success. Stevens climbed into the car, shaking his head. Nope, those were novels. Some of my favorites. I have them on my e-reader, of course, but who knows how long I'll be able to keep that thing charged. Let's go. Chapter 4. I rubbed my eyes and yawned. I'd fallen asleep on the highway out of town and had no idea where we were or what time it was. The permanent twilight of daytime had faded into thick darkness. The lights of the dashboard illuminated Stevens' face, but aside from that, all I could see were the 2 cones of lighted highway in front of the car. Where are we? Just past Roanoke, Stevens said. Almost halfway. You were out. Feeling better? Yeah, I guess. I rubbed my eyes again and checked my phone. Still no signal. I don't think that's coming back, Stevens said. Or if it does, it'll be spotty. But what happened? There wasn't a big earthquake or explosion or anything. What took out the net? Stevens shrugged. Maybe someone just turned it off. Or pieces of it. Cell towers need electricity. If I was in control of an electrical production facility, like a dam or a coal plant, I'd probably cut off anything I didn't think was important. And I'd make people pay to get power. Those guys are going to be the new kings of the world. But how did they know they could get away with it now? I only knew because of Starla. The name tasted bitter. She only knew because her dad was high up in the government. Surely no one else knows the President and Congress have deserted us. You'd be amazed at how fast that kind of information travels. Stevens glanced at me. Electrical grids are controlled by the government. All it would take would be a phone call to someone who tried to get in on the desertion but got left behind. In fact, those guys are probably screaming it to the housetops. I was kind of surprised you hadn't posted anything. I squirmed in my seat, trying to get comfortable. I was going to. Had it all ready. Then the net went down. I was going to put it in the queue, in case things went live again, but I decided it was immature. Having this kind of information ahead of the curve is useful, too, Stevens said. In a few days, everyone will be fighting over the last of the food supplies. Being prepared helps, but having a direct connect to the info, that's king. If you're hungry, grab a snack bar. I want to get as close to Leah's as we can before we stop. I unfastened my seatbelt and twisted around in the seat. Rummaging in the canned foods box, I found the pile of snack bars. I grabbed two and my fingers brushed against the velvet surface. Puzzled, I pushed the extra snack bars aside. Oh, yeah, the stash. I sat down, fastened my belt, and ripped open one of the bars. You want one? Stevens reached out a hand and took it without a word. I ripped the second bar open. So, what's in that stash you ran back for? Stevens glanced at me from the corner of his eyes. His lips quirked up. Not marijuana, if that's what you're thinking. I started to speak, then realized I had no answer to that. I snapped my teeth closed. It's gold. Stevens popped the last of his snack bar out of the wrapper and into his mouth. Gold? I choked. Stevens reached over and slapped me on the back a couple times. Like, gold, gold? Yeah, gold, gold. Heavy, shiny metal. Used for jewelry and teeth. He wagged his hand back and forth. Maybe not teeth anymore. But yeah. It's useful stuff. Small, high value to weight ratio. Everyone wants it, even if it would be smarter to have something else, like food or ammunition. Paper money will be worthless, soon. But gold will always have value. To someone. Is it like coins? Or, I broke off, waving my wrapper in confusion. Not that it was any of my business, but Stevens didn't seem to mind answering my questions. Take a look if you want. I have a few coins, but we'll save those for big-ticket items. Mostly it's in 1-gram bars, but a few 50s. A gram is worth about $100, these days. You need the small ones to buy small things. I stared at him. How much is the whole bag worth? The older man shrugged. Not sure. I could tell you how much I paid for it, but the value right now is basically what people are willing to trade for it. And that's going to go down before it goes back up. Right now, we could probably use cash to buy stuff. But in a few days people will start to realize cash is worthless. Then we'll need the gold. Some folks will have no idea what gold is worth, so it'll be a negotiation. As folks realize the value of food and power, those negotiations will get harder. That's why I want to get to Leah's as soon as possible. She's pretty self-sufficient. We can save the gold until we need it. I leaned back in my seat, my brain spinning. Stevens had said a few 50s. Undoubtedly, that bag held more money than I'd ever seen in my life. What if someone tries to take it? Stevens smiled grimly. That's what the guns are for. What guns? I hadn't seen any weapons. You own guns? Aren't you a pacifist? Stevens shook his head. Have you forgotten everything I taught you? I believe in self-defense. Using martial arts is excellent self-defense, and if it's enough, then that's the way to go. But sometimes self-defense requires gunpowder. Let's pull off up here. I need a break. You can drive, right? We drove for hours. It was only 500 miles from Alexandria to Oak Ridge, but the roads were in poor repair. Since the Exodus had started 70 years before, taxes were poured into that instead of infrastructure. What's the point of building roads that will last 100 years if everyone would be gone in 70? Little did we know that everyone didn't mean everyone. So, the interstates were full of potholes and crumbling bridges. In several places we had to follow long-established detours off the highway and around the broken bits. Local roads were generally in better repair. People still drove them regularly. What would have taken 8 hours at the height of the American auto era took twice that long. Around 1, Stevens called a halt. We've still got about 5 hours to go, but the car needs to recharge. Let's see if there's any power at this rest stop. I guided the car off the highway and into an automated rest stop. I drove up to a huge roll-up door. I don't have a credit card, I said, sheepishly. No matter. Stevens handed me his phone. Just wave it at the window. The near field should be strong enough. Never mind. He smirked. I'm sure you know how it works. I forced myself not to roll my eyes at the master. Of course, I knew how near field worked. I was a self-taught hacker and computer nerd. I knew how all of it worked. Although, if the net was going to go down permanently, my skills might soon be less relevant than I'd like. I waved the phone. The light on the panel glowed green and the door cranked slowly up. I guess they aren't dependent on the net to operate, I said, handing the phone back to Stevens. You still got no signal. Stevens took his phone. Take her in. I drove the little car forward. Lights sprang on inside the massive building. It wasn't tall, trucks used different stations, but it was about 30 feet wide and 40 long. This one had room for about 12 cars at full capacity. I followed the flashing arrows that directed us to the far left lane. The hulking space was empty, so I pulled forward to the first slot and turned off the car. A green button appeared on Stevens' phone, and he pressed it. Plastic lowered over the car, encasing it in a bubble. The fans whirred, and the bubble filled with air. Once the fans stopped, we got out of the car. One side of the bubble connected to a clear tunnel that led the length of the building. Only the first segment, nearest our car, was pressurized. We followed the tunnel to use the facilities. When we returned to the car, Stevens pulled a couple of boxes out of the back seat. We can lay the seats back and get some sleep if we put these outside. But I don't want anyone taking them. Put the books out there, I suggested. No one's going to want some old books, right? I wasn't sure why Stevens had insisted on bringing them. You're probably right, at least for now. He pulled the box of books out and hefted the canned food back inside. In a few months, they'll be desirable. In a few years, they'll be invaluable. These are an investment in the future. Think about it, if our car broke down, how would you fix it? I'd just call a repair shop. Oh, yeah, the network is down. I shook my head. I keep forgetting, this is forever. The net isn't coming back online. Not for free, that's for sure. Stevens shoved the book boxes close beside the car, then climbed back in. He lowered the windows a few inches and reclined his seat. In the tiny car, there was barely room for him to stretch out, and he wasn't a tall man. I would be cramped. Get in. The net will probably come back online in chunks, and you'll have to pay for access to valuable data. And lots of it will probably go missing in the meantime. Books are going to be a commodity. Now get some sleep. Hey, Gimme your phone. I snapped my seat back upright again. I think I can hack the system, so it alerts us if anyone else comes in. Stevens held up a hand. Not necessary. One of the downsides of these facilities is the single light source. As if in response to his words, the lights went out. Blackness darker than I had ever seen in the city slammed down like a heavy drapery. Stevens laughed. See what I mean? You don't move for a few minutes, the lights go out. If you move, they come on. If anyone comes in, we'll know. Chapter 5. Without notice, the light stabbed down. I yelped and jerked upright. My neck and shoulders ached, my butt hurt from the lightly upholstered seat, my mouth felt dry and metallic. I blinked my dry eyes. You okay? I asked Stevens. The older man nodded and reached for his water bottle. Crap, I should have refilled this. I'm going to the can. Wait, I said. Why did the lights come on? Is someone coming in? Stevens opened the door and climbed out slowly. I think that's just our wake-up call. I only paid for 4 hours of air and power. He stretched and twisted. You coming? In a minute. I rummaged in my messenger bag and pulled out my water bottle and a small zippered bag. Are we going to eat before we leave? The older man shoved the book boxes back inside and locked the car. Just in case, he said. Yeah, we'll eat something. Maybe some of that fruit you saved. Why? I have to do my insulin, I said, holding up the pouch. Stevens raised an eyebrow. I forgot you're diabetic. That's going to make things complicated. What do you mean? We started toward the bathrooms. How much insulin do you have? Where are you going to get more? I stopped dead still and stared at the man. I'd never thought about it. Insulin was delivered each month with the food allowance from the government. Smog. Stevens nodded, turning toward the bathroom again. We just got the delivery on Monday. I followed him down the tunnel. I've got about a month's supply, assuming my food intake stays relatively steady. Can you go longer if you eat less? Stevens asked as we washed our hands a few minutes later. He went to the potable water dispenser, tapped on his phone to authorize payment, and filled the bottle. He held out a hand. Fill yours, too. I handed over the water bottle. I don't know. About the food, I mean. Theoretically, yes, but in practice it isn't as simple as that. I unzipped the pouch on my belt, exposing the insulin pump. It was about 1 inch wide and 3 inches long. With a snap, the vial nestled inside popped out and I clicked a new one into place. After zipping the pouch shut, I jiggled the empty vial in my hand. I should probably hold on to this. Might need it if I can find a source. I dropped the empty vial into the zippered bag. As we walked back to the car, Stevens asked casually, "How long does that battery last?" For the second time, I stopped, frozen in place. Well, Smog, I am screwed. I shoved my fingers into my hair, rumpling it. I think it's good for a year. What am I going to do? And it's not just batteries, there's testing supplies, too. Stevens took my arm and urged me back to the car. We'll figure something. First things first, you're okay for a month, right? I nodded and forced my legs to move. I was good for a month, that was plenty of time to figure out an answer. Someone must know how to make insulin. And people used to use syringes before pumps were invented. I just had to figure out the old way of doing things before I ran out. Just as we reached the bubble, the lights went out. The transparent panels in the roof provided dim illumination, and red emergency lights flickered on. That's not normal, Stevens said, looking at the clock on his phone. We should have another 3 minutes of lights and air before the bubble starts to deflate. He looked around. This isn't the get-out warning. I think it's a power problem. Are we going to be able to open those big doors? I pointed to the slatted metal doors in front of the car. And what about this bubble? How do we get it off the car? The good news is, we're all powered up. Stevens scratched his chin for a minute, then nodded. Here's what we're going to do. You get in the car, driver's seat. I'll take a pack and see if I can manually open the door and bubble. Then you'll drive out. Overpressure the car, and I'll jump in. It wears the battery, but since we just topped off, it should be fine until we get to Leah's. I got in and pressed the start button. The car pinged to let us know it was alive and fully charged. I squinted through the plastic bubble, trying to see Stevens. With a sudden wrenching noise, the door at the front of the building started ratcheting up. When it reached full height, Stevens jogged toward me. He lifted the hem of the plastic bubble, unsticking the magnetic seal. Holding it above his head, he motioned for me to pull the car forward. I eased under the plastic, with Stevens guiding it over the top of the car. When it was clear of the plastic, I stopped. I hit the overpressure button and waited for Stevens to climb in, but the old man waved me forward. I pulled the car the rest of the way out of the building. As I watched in the rearview mirror, Stevens lowered the door and trotted over. He whipped the door open, jumped in and slammed it shut. I grunted. You're fast. We only lost 20% of the air. The previous night, when we changed drivers, I hadn't moved fast enough, and we had to wear our packs until the car was able to pump in enough filtered air. Stevens pulled the mask off his face. Lots of practice. You don't ride in a car much, do you? I shook my head. Howard doesn't have one. I shrugged. I guess you don't need one if you never leave the apartment block. I left as often as possible, especially after Mom had died. Couldn't stand being in the same space with Howard and Dozer. I guess I could have hung out in the common rooms, but those were just too depressing. The dojon had been my refuge. The thought that I'd never go there again, that no one would train there again, made my heart sink. Why'd you bother closing the door? I asked as I guided the car back out onto the road. Without power, the building is kind of useless. The power might come back on, Stevens said. But then the door would close on its own, right? Maybe. But even if the power doesn't come back on, someone could take refuge in there. Or at least, use the bathroom. We don't want animals wandering in. I guess, I said, slowly. But this is the apocalypse, right? It's every man for himself. Stevens twisted in his seat to look at me. You don't really believe that, I hope. That attitude is going to make this the apocalypse. I believe we need to help each other through this. Then why did we bolt? I demanded. If you're so ready to help everyone, we should have stayed there and fixed the world. Stevens shook his head. Just because I want to help people doesn't mean I should be stupid. If this is as bad as I think it's going to be, then lots of people in the cities will die. No food, no power, no way to get out. We needed to leave, to give ourselves a chance. But that doesn't mean we need to make things harder for anyone else trying to do the same. And besides, you're going to need help, a lot of help. Put out into the world that which you hope to receive. Call it karma, the golden rule, whatever, it's important. We drove in silence for a while, until my insulin pump vibrated. Can I get something to eat, please? I asked, suddenly realizing I was completely dependent on Stevens' goodwill. Good thing the man was into karma. How does that thing work? Stevens asked. What thing? I looked around the car for something amiss. The insulin pump. Is it completely automated? Yeah, it has a sensor. It monitors my blood sugar every 15 minutes and releases microbursts as needed. It vibrates if my levels go too low, or if the insulin is low. If I ignore that, it starts beeping. I hadn't done that in a long time, not after I ended up in the hospital when I was 12. The sky lightened, although we couldn't see the sunrise through the thick smog. As I drove, I tapped a rhythm on the steering wheel, trying hard to think of nothing. Not Starla and Dozer, or my insulin pump, or Howard. Or what I was going to do with my life, if I survived, because my only skills were in making funny videos and hacking computers. Not much call for that if there was no power. Take the next exit, Steven said, peering out the window at a road sign. I blinked. Although I'd been driving, I'd been so engrossed in my own thoughts, I hadn't noticed the time passing. It was full daylight now, but it was hard to tell with the thick vegetation growing around them. Are we in Tennessee? It's like a jungle here. Stevens nodded. I guess it used to be different, but with the climate change, he shrugged. Plants that used to thrive die, and other stuff, mostly noxious weeds and vines, grow like there's no tomorrow. Leah's place is up in the mountains, but I don't think she gets any snow. We took an exit labeled Greenville and followed the road around the town and up into more mountainous country. Beyond the urban area, we passed a sign marking the SAB, the service area border. What town am I looking for? I asked as I slalomed around potholes. This road had seen better days. As the exodus had slowly emptied the planet, most of those still on Earth had migrated to the cities. Rural areas emptied, except for those running the big industrial farms. The government refused to provide services out in the sticks. Every bit of energy and materials expended on Earth was that much less going into the exodus. Most of the people who refused to move to the cities had no intention of leaving the planet. Some of them were religious nuts who believed leaving the planet might prevent them from reaching heaven. I wasn't sure if there was a God, but I figured if he existed, he wasn't limited to one tiny planet. There were also those who just didn't like other people. Those folks would rather take their chances staying behind. Or maybe they figured they'd wait until their turn to go upstairs got closer, and then they'd make their way to the shuttle port. But anyone who lived beyond the SABs had to fend for themselves. Few people knew how to do that. I hadn't really thought about where we were going. I trusted the old man. But who was this Leah, and how did she survive beyond the SAB? Stevens grinned. You aren't looking for a town. Leah's a true prepper. She lives in the back of beyond. Off the grid. What's a prepper? I asked. People who are prepared for the worst. It used to be quite a thing, I guess, before the exodus. He stroked his chin. But once Exocorp started moving people off planet, it lost popularity. But there's still a group of hardcore preppers. They have no intention of trusting Exocorp. They don't want to leave the planet, and they're prepared to do whatever it takes to survive. Right. Off the grid, you mean she doesn't have power or net access? I sighed. Life without the net would be dull. I couldn't really believe it wouldn't come back online. Not sure about the net, but she has power. Turn here. We passed a faded and broken sign that read Great Smoky Mountain. The rest was broken off, but I had heard of the Great Smoky Mountains. It was some kind of wildlife refuge in the old times, but now it was just a wilderness area. Some conspiracy theories on the net said Exocorp was just a bunch of wealthy folks holed up in the Smokies, and instead of shipping people off planet they were just killing them and dumping the bodies in the ocean. It was one of the more ridiculous theories I'd read, but it made me nervous about entering the area. Have you been here before? I asked. A couple times, Stevens said. Leah was my wife's cousin. Rietta and I came up to visit when we first got married. We brought the kids out once, when they were little. And I checked on her a few years back. It's changed a lot. Not as many people. Not as much water in the streams. Snowpack has been decreasing for decades, but it's become more noticeable lately. He gazed out the window as we drove. The thick trees blocked the dim sunlight, but they were spindly and twisted, not thick and strong as the pictures always showed. Dense clumps of brush filled the space under the trees. Don't touch those plants. Stevens pointed at the underbrush. Toxic. Poison oak or ivy. Or a combination. I read somewhere that the two plants cross-pollinated and spread. Following Stevens' directions, I drove deep into the mountains. We crossed a couple narrow streams, green with mossy rocks and waterfalls. We climbed above the visible smog, and the brighter light filtered through the trees, glinting off the many tiny trickles of water. I thought you said there wasn't as much water. Stevens laughed. It looks like a lot, but it's way less than they used to get. See all that low bushy growth near the stream? That used to be underwater most of the year. I thought you hadn't been up here since your kids were little. I glanced at the older man. I came up last year, just for a quick visit. I wanted to check on Leah and negotiate with her. What do you mean, negotiate? I slowed the car to navigate around a downed tree across the road. I told you she's a prepper. She's spent most of her adult life building a sustainable refuge. Stevens shrugged one shoulder. After I decided to not go upstairs, I came to visit Leah, to see if I could convince her to take me on. Take you on? I was starting to feel like a parrot. She has a little compound up here. He glanced at me, then looked away. She has, I guess you could call them renters, although she doesn't own the property. But she runs the place, and she decides who can move in. Everyone has to pull their own weight. Why don't you pull off the road up here? He pointed to a wide space. Not that anyone is likely to come up behind us, but just in case. I pulled the car off the road and stopped, setting the brakes. Then I turned in my seat, so I was facing Stevens. What are you not telling me? She isn't expecting me to bring anyone. I wasn't authorized to plus one. He barked out a humorless laugh. If you want to come in, we're going to need to identify your value to the community. Besides hacking, bookkeeping, and taekwondo, what can you do? I stared at him. Videos? Stevens shook his head. Not much call for that. Have you worked with animals? Done any cooking? Don't suppose you can make shoes? I shook his head in response to each question, my heart sinking into my toes. Shoes? Who makes shoes? It would be a useful skill, Stevens said. These folks plan to live here forever. And some of them have, or will have, children or grandchildren. They're looking for long-term sustainability. Shoes are pretty specialized construction. Oh, what about construction? Have you built anything? Where would I do that? I wailed. Those might be things you learned as a kid. They don't teach that stuff anymore. Stevens held up his hands. We'll come up with something. You can be my apprentice. Are you willing to learn some of that stuff? I don't really have a choice, do I? I dropped my head into my hands. Not if I want to survive. Stevens put a hand on my shoulder. You always have a choice, son. Sometimes none of them are great, but you always have a choice. Chapter 6. We drove up to a narrow, overgrown lane. A couple downed trees lay across it, blocking traffic, but the ruts in the road looked fresh. Stevens pointed out the still green leaves that were crushed into the dirt. I'm going to move those trees out of the way. You pull the car through. He reached for his pack. I held up a hand. If I'm your apprentice, I should be doing the heavy lifting. If anyone is watching, I want to give a good first impression. Stevens narrowed his eyes. Why would you think anyone is watching? My lips twisted into a grin. I pointed up into a nearby tree. See that tiny light? Video camera. They're watching us. I pressed the overpressure button, unfastened my seatbelt, and pulled the pack over my face. When the light turned green, I swung the door open, leaped out and slammed it shut. Stevens gave me a thumbs up through the window and climbed over the center console into the driver's seat. The trees were heavier than I expected, but they swung away smoothly once I figured out which direction to pull. The thicker ends were mounted on hinged posts buried in the undergrowth. I pushed two inward and pulled the third one back toward the car. Once the road was clear, Stevens drove through. Remembering the lecture from the rest stop, and knowing someone was watching, I carefully returned the gates to their original positions. I was about to climb back into the car, but a thought stopped me. Holding up one finger at Stevens, I ducked through the gate and ran back to the ruts near the paved road. I picked up the crushed leaves. Holding them up, I looked straight at the camera, then tossed them into the undergrowth. Then I ducked under the gate and jogged back to the car. Once inside, Stevens set the vehicle rolling again. I'm not sure letting them know you saw the camera is good, Stevens said, casually. If it was mine, I'd want to know it was spotted. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and glanced at the screen. Still no service. Plus, if they have surveillance, they need someone to run it. I want them to know I'm up on this stuff. In that case, don't bother checking your phone again. Everyone knows there's no service out here. You'd look like total pet. That's a derogatory term for someone from the city. Stevens sighed. The dirt road wound through tiny valleys and up the side of a partially barren mountain. I stared out the window at the miles and miles of rolling hills. There's nothing out here, no buildings, roads, nothing. If you look carefully, you can see the straight line where the highway runs. Stevens gestured down the valley. Nature rarely runs in straight lines, so it sticks out if you know what to look for. Nature rarely leaves clear-cut areas like this, too. He gestured at the barren hillside. This area was burned and cleared within the last 2 years. Probably for visibility. They want to see who's coming up their mountain. Isn't that what the cameras are for? At the slow speed this rough road allowed, I had spotted 2 more. Which probably meant I'd missed a few. Haven't you learned yet that power is fickle? Stevens turned off the road again, onto a narrower dirt track. Someday, those cameras will fail, and then they'll need to rely on human eyes. We drove a while longer, and finally came to a steep, narrow gap. The road was barred again, but this time, people met us. A man with bright colors painted on his pack mask, a heavy dark jacket, a beaten-up cowboy hat, and an evil-looking gun stood in front of the blocked road. Stevens stopped the car a good 10 feet away from him. We're both going to get out. Don't worry about the air, we'll keep our packs until we get up to the house. Make sure you keep your hands visible and empty at all times. I stared at Stevens to see if he was kidding, but the old man's face was deadly serious. Shoving my phone back into my pocket, I pulled my pack over my face. I nodded once at Stevens, and we both climbed slowly out of the car. I watched Stevens and tried to mimic his movements. The master held his hand out from his body, palms facing forward, fingers pointed downward almost as if asking for something. It felt awkward to hold my hands like that, but I did it anyway. Master Stevens had been right every time, so far, and he knew these people. I didn't. The man gestured with the gun, pointing toward a spot on the ground. Stevens stepped forward. When the man waved the gun again, Stevens stopped. "State your business," the guard said. "Leah should be expecting me," he said. Joshua Stevens. "I came up last year, and she said I was welcome back." "Yeah, I remember you," the man said, his drawl thick. "Miss Leah mentioned you might be up this way sometime soon. We heard things changed out there in the void." "The void?" I didn't ask. The guy with the gun didn't appear very friendly. "I'm Charlie." "Who's the kid?" The gun swung my direction, stopping just short of pointing directly at me. "That's my apprentice, Zane Torres." Stevens' tone was friendly, as if he were smiling, though it was hard to tell through the plastic of the pack. "I'm hoping Leah will have room for another gardener." I darted a glance at Stevens. I knew less about gardens than I did about shoes. Charlie pushed his hat back on his head. "She might be better if he was a girl, but she might be okay with a boy." "Let me check." Charlie turned away and lifted a pole that lay on the ground by the side of the road. Affixing a triangle of green and white squares, and another of solid blue, he raised the pole. The flags fluttered in the breeze, high above his head. He waved the pole back and forth, 3 times, paused, then waved twice. "She says bring him up." We climbed back in the car while Charlie stowed his flags and opened the gate. We kept our packs on, and Stevens switched the car's filters to idle. "Saves a little power." "The void?" I asked, my voice muffled by the pack. Stevens' eyes twinkled. "That's what they call the outside world. The void, the abyss, the land of the lost. I think someone watched too much science fiction when they were younger." "Thanks for not asking, Charlie." "They don't like outsiders. They've always tolerated me, because Leah likes me and we're family." "But you're unknown. Asking questions reminds them you're a noob. If you have questions, ask me or Leah. Otherwise, try to keep your mouth shut." "What was with the flags? And how did he check if it was okay to bring me up?" I hated wearing a pack. My nose always started to itch, or I needed to rub my eyes when it was on. "The flags must be some kind of code. Probably one was for known visitor and the other for unknown or something like that." Stevens smiled. "But I'm pretty sure Charlie was using a radio." "The flags are for practice, right now." And the number of times he waved meant something, too? "I'm sure it did, but they won't tell us what. At least not until we've been here a while and they trust us." Stevens eased the little car through the gate and behind a small ATV. Another man appeared out of a rough-looking cabin hidden behind an outcropping of rock. He glanced back at us, then waved at Charlie and climbed onto the ATV. He flipped a few switches, and sent the little electric vehicle skidding up the road. "Why did he say it would be better if I was a girl?" I asked as we climbed across the barren hillside behind the ATV. Stevens laughed without humor. "They're probably short on women. I pity any girls who stumble across this place. Leah's a good person, but some of the company she keeps." He shook his head. We drove in silence for a while. I gazed out the window at the burnt tree trunks and dusty earth. I was no expert on ecology, but if I remembered correctly from my earth sciences classes, they could be in for some trouble with a heavy rainstorm. With no plants to keep the dirt in place, they could expect a couple landslides. "How often does it rain here?" Stevens nodded. "Not as often as it used to, but yeah, I'm with you. Clear-cutting might provide good visibility, but it could be dangerous. Make a note not to get caught out here when it rains." "How long are you planning on staying here?" I asked. Stevens drove in silence for a few minutes. The little car whined up the hills, then coasted in silence on the downward slopes. "Maybe forever," he finally said. "Things are going to get ugly out there. Heck, Things are going to get ugly here, trying to keep random people out. Thousands of people will starve in the cities, unless someone gets things organized, and I wouldn't count on that happening anytime soon. Exocorp was careful to take the best and the brightest with them, whenever possible. I'm sure someone will step up to fill the leadership void, but in situations like this, it isn't usually the most benevolent who take over. The little ATV put on a burst of speed and pulled ahead, skidding to a stop in front of another gate. Beyond that fence, the forest began again. The driver parked his vehicle to the side and opened the gate. Another man stood on the far side, a wide-brimmed hat shading his eyes and leaving his pack-covered face hidden in shadow. We drove up and Stevens lowered his window. "Good day." "Afternoon," the guard said. "Lester says you're going up to see Ms. Leah. Follow the road straight up the hill. Don't turn off the main track, we'll know if you do, and we won't be happy." He turned away without another word. Stevens closed the window and moved the car forward. "See if you can spot their cameras on the way." As we continued up the shaded path, I pointed out 4 separate cameras. There were probably more, but they weren't as readily visible. The road climbed steadily, and several smaller tracks branched off left and right. They all looked well-traveled and well-maintained. A mile or so past the gate, the road started zigzagging up the mountain again. Thin trees clung to the steep hillside, and heavy underbrush covered the ground. I wasn't afraid of heights, but the edge of the road, more of a track, really, was uncomfortably close to their wheels in places. My stomach swooped as we took the hairpin turns. The view was spectacular. Up here, the air looked clear, but it was no less toxic. A haze settled in the valleys of the mountains below, and the clearer sunlight glinted off invisible water. The thick foliage gave the whole area a woolly appearance, with the occasional rocky outcropping breaking the flow of green. Finally, the road flattened out again, and we drove back into a thickly wooded area. The light dimmed, and the trees crowded close to the road. I spotted 3 more cameras before we reached an open space. A field of wildflowers stretched across the open meadow. The track cut across the middle, ending in front of a large building. The house was long and heavy, with a dark green metal roof. The walls were cut from rough-hewn logs. Wide windows let light into the building, but heavy wood shutters hung on either side of each window. A narrow porch with a lower green roof shaded the front door. Behind the house, a huge cliff reared up, blocking most of the sky. Nearby, I could see a scattering of smaller log buildings with rough wood shake roofs. Stevens pulled the car up to the side of the front door and stopped. He turned to me. "Let me do the talking, unless she asks you a direct question." "I thought this woman was a friend of yours," I said. "Seemed like an odd attitude for friend." "She is." Stevens nodded, once. "But she's also prickly. And kind of paranoid." "Oh, who am I kidding? She's very paranoid. Most preppers are. And with what's happened in the last day or 2, she's probably expecting a deluge of freeloaders. We need to convince her you're worth keeping around. Leave your stuff in the car. We'll lock it." With that, he climbed out of the car. I followed, wondering what I'd gotten myself into. Chapter 7. Stevens opened the front door, stepping inside, and gesturing for me to hurry up. A narrow airlock provided places to hang coats and leave shoes, but the pegs and racks were empty. With the outer door closed, fans started pumping clean air in. Stevens knocked loudly on the interior door. While we waited, we pulled our packs off our faces. Stevens hung his on a peg, but I hung mine on my belt. I wasn't leaving anything necessary where I couldn't get it easily. Finally, with a hiss of air, the door swung open. We stepped into a large open space with huge smoothwood columns, probably whole trees, holding up the roof. The room was 2 stories high, with a narrow stairway leading up to a balcony along the far wall. The heads of several animals hung on the side walls, and a skin of some kind lay in front of a massive fireplace. Hand-braided rugs covered the wood plank floor, and several rows of wooden tables and benches filled the room. A thin, angular woman with her graying hair braided around her head stood beside the door. "Leah," Stephen said, stepping forward to clasp her hand in both of his. "Thank you for allowing us in." He leaned forward to kiss her quickly on each cheek. The woman nodded at Stevens, pulling her hand away after the greeting. She looked Stevens up and down without smiling. "I'd say it's good to see you, but since I know why you're here, it really isn't." Her voice sounded rough, as if it was rarely used. Her face looked old, with heavy wrinkles around the eyes and cheeks. The eyes shifted to me, and I felt the weight of her gaze like a stone. "This is your apprentice?" She sounded skeptical. "Leah, this is Zane Torres. He's one of my Taekwondo students, and an expert with computers." I took the hand the woman held out and shook it firmly. Her calloused skin rubbed against my palm and her bony fingers squeezed my hand, hard. I increased the pressure, matching the old woman. I didn't want to hurt her, but this felt like some kind of test. When she released her grip, I let go quickly, pulling my hand away. The woman's eyes traveled across my face and down my body, impersonal, assessing. "Computers? We have no use for those, here. Can you clean out a stall?" I glanced at Stevens. When the man nodded, I answered. "I haven't ever done it, but I'm sure I can. I'm strong. But with all due respect, I saw your cameras on the way up. Surely someone must manage your system." Leah's eyes narrowed. "I've got someone for that," she said. "Able-bodied folks need to be pulling their weight. You can help with the cameras after you finish any real work. Too bad you aren't a girl." A shiver trickled up my spine and I squirmed, grateful I wasn't female. The tone of her voice, along with the discussion on the way up the hill, made me distinctly uncomfortable. "I can cook, if that helps." The woman laughed, loud and angry. "I mention women and you immediately think of cooking? Nice attitude for a modern man." I started to answer but caught Stephen's quick head shake out of the corner of my eye. "Zane's a very good cook," the old man said, deflecting Leah's scrutiny to him. "You should try his apple crisp sometime. Do you have room for us in the bunkhouse?" Leah wrinkled her nose. "You have your usual room here in the main house. The boy can find a free bunk in cabin 7. Dinner is at 6. Louisa will add you to the chore roster. Your first shift will be at 5 tomorrow morning. Don't be late. Breakfast is at 7. Without another word, Leah turned and walked away. I looked at Stevens. The man gave another tiny shake of his head. "Let's get our gear settled," Stevens said. We went back out and moved the car around to the side of the house. Here a much larger door led to an equally large airlock. We stacked the contents of the car inside the space. "You stay here," Stevens said. "I'll move the car out of the way." When he returned, we pulled the heavy outer door closed. Stevens pressed a button. An indicator light turned red and fans blew. He pointed to a crank. "If the power is out, you can circulate the air by hand. It's a lot easier in the smaller airlock, of course. They have solar panels, wind turbines, and even a small paddle wheel and a creek over there to generate power." He waved away from the house to indicate the creek. "Leah had big batteries put in a few years ago, so they can store the power, too. But she's got everything rigged up to run on muscle." He grinned and tapped his bicep. The light turned green, and Stevens pulled a lever. The inner door rolled up into the building. We stepped into a dim room with a low ceiling. Let's put the food on these shelves. He gestured to the metal racks that filled the far end of the wide room. They're sorted by food, so put things where they belong. This place is basically a big commune, so anything you bring in, you're expected to share. We moved the canned goods to the appropriate shelves. Stevens put the case of pack filters on another shelf and grabbed a handcart just inside the rolling door. Stack the book boxes on there and grab your duffel. The old man picked up 2 more duffel bags and slung them onto his back. Take your shoes off. We'll leave them in the front airlock. No shoes inside. What's that other duffel bag? I shifted the boxes onto the cart, shouldered my own bag, and picked up our shoes by the laces. Tipping the cart so I could pull it along behind, I followed Stevens across the room. My guns. We don't share weapons. Everyone has their own. I'll teach you how to shoot these. That's a skill you're going to need. The door on the far side of the room led to a short hallway that ended in the room where they'd met Leah. Leave the shoes, the books, and your bag here. We'll grab it when we come back. I hung my duffel bag over the handle of the handcart. I briefly considered leaving the messenger bag, but it contained not only my computer, but my supply of insulin and the tiny bag of gold Stevens had asked me to carry. He decided we should split it between the 2 of us, just in case. In case of what, he didn't say, but I could imagine. I noticed Stevens hadn't suggested we share the gold with Leah and the community. We went up the stairs to the 2nd-story balcony. Stevens led the way to a door at the end. Bedrooms are down this way. I'll show you where mine is, in case you need to find me after hours. We walked down a bare hallway. Wooden floor and walls with no decoration. A narrow skylight let in light. Stevens stopped at the 3rd door on the right. The door led to a shadowy room. Stevens crossed to the window and opened the curtains. Light streamed across the blonde wood of the floor. Although the hall had been bare, this room was decorated with flowered curtains, a bookshelf filled with volumes, and several watercolor paintings of birds and animals. The high bed frame made of thin polished logs twisted into swirls and curves held a thick bed covered by a bright-colored patchwork quilt. Stevens dropped one of his bags on the floor and placed the other carefully on the bed. He opened the zipper and pulled out a handgun and some leather straps. Belting the leather around his waist, he tucked the pistol into the holster and zipped the bag shut. He caught me watching and grinned. Gotta show 'em we're tough. Don't know if you noticed every guy out there had at least one gun. They don't respect anyone until they prove themselves. This shows I at least own a gun, and they'd better think twice before messing with me. He patted the holster gently. What about me? I asked. Stevens grabbed a key laying on the dresser and opened the door. You're a kid. I'm old. I need the extra oomph a gun gives me. Besides, you can show them your mad martial arts skills. We went out and Stevens locked the door, pocketing the key. But you're the master. Exactly. Once they see what you can do, they won't come near me. Stevens shook his head and let the smile fade off his face. As my apprentice, they should leave you alone. If anyone tries anything, don't be afraid to protect yourself. But whatever you do, don't throw the first punch. We walked back down the stairs. Grab your bag. You're in one of the bunkhouses. I'll show you where it is. We left the house through the front room, pulling our shoes on in the airlock. A path led past Stevens' car and around the main house to the smaller buildings. A tiny, 2-person airlock led us into a big open building with a dozen sets of bunk beds. At the end of each bed sat 2 locking trunks. Stevens looked around. Look for a trunk that's open and empty. That means the bunk is available. You can stash your stuff there. The bunk nearest the door had an empty trunk, so I dropped my full duffel into the box and grabbed the key hanging from a hook above it. I started to lock the box but paused. "Is it safe to leave my computer here?" I asked. "For tonight, bring it along with you. Once you're settled, and we get the lay of the land, you can figure that out. You can always put it in the car if you don't think it's safe here," Stevens said. We set off to the rear of the property. The big house stood right against the rock cliff behind it. "There are caves here," Stevens said. "The house has direct access to them. In fact, some of the storage spaces are built right into the cliff." He pointed through the trees. "If you look through there, you can see a corner of one of the fields. They've developed some strains of plants that can survive the toxic air and low sunday. There are also hydroponics and a greenhouse down there. The bath is over here." Stevens walked to a small building with smoke puffing out of the chimney. "Are they burning something?" I asked. "That's not smoke, it's steam." Stevens opened the front door, and we passed through the airlock. When he opened the inner door, hot, moist air rolled over us. We walked in, stopping just to the left of the door. Steam rolled off 2 huge tubs. A stack of towels lay on a shelf nearby. They tapped into some hot springs a few decades ago. Great soaking tubs. "Leave your shoes in the airlock. And whatever you do, make sure you shower before you get in. No dirt in the hot tubs." He pointed to some cubicles with shower heads beside the airlock. Is this the only place to take a shower?" I asked. "Yeah, if you have any nudity issues, you'll have to get over them." Stevens grinned. "It's just, I can't do the hot tub. You know, my pump." I gestured to my belt. Stevens' face fell. "Yeah, I guess we need to talk about that." Behind him, the door swung open, and 3 huge, dirty men stomped in. 2 of them wore belts with holsters, the third carried a rifle. If they noticed us, they gave no indication. Laughing and arguing, then jostled into the room, chucking their clothing as they went. By the time they'd reached the showers, they'd stripped off most of their clothes. Carefully stowing their weapons on a shelf above the showers, they finished the job. I averted my eyes. "Come on," Stevens muttered. His own face looked a bit red. So much for getting over nudity issues. But maybe it was the heat. We made our way through the airlock, pulling our packs on over our faces before heading back outside. Stevens led the way back to the main house and to his room. He unlocked the door and gestured for me to enter. Then he locked the door behind us, leaving the key in the keyhole. Stevens shucked his gear and perched on the bed, pointing to the small chair and writing table in the corner. I sat, carefully setting my messenger bag on the floor beside me. Master Stevens cleared his throat. "You can't live without that stuff, can you?" He gestured to the bag. I shook my head. I'd survived for a while. When I let my pump run out of insulin, my blood sugar skyrockets. I get irritable and tired. Then my vision gets blurry. And I'm really thirsty. I've never gone too long without it, so I'm not sure what would happen after that, but eventually my kidneys would shut down. "How long?" Stevens asked. "Before I run out?" I leaned down to open the bag and count again. I already knew exactly how many vials of shelf-stable insulin were nestled in the protective case, but somehow, I felt like I should check again. "No," Stevens said. "After you run out." "How long until your kidneys go?" I shook my head. "I don't know. It's not something I ever thought I'd have to worry about." Stevens nodded. "Okay, so we need to find you a source of insulin." "I'm not sure it's that easy," I said. "Well, where does that stuff come from?" Stevens asked, pointing to the bag again. I stared, dumbstruck. I don't know. So many things I'd taken for granted all these years were now vitally important. I dug in the bag and pulled out the box. It says Genotech, Albuquerque, New Mexico. That's where we start, then, Stevens said. Maybe there's somewhere closer. I pulled out my phone and checked the signal. If we had net access, it would be a lot easier to figure this out. Unless you make friends with Leah's security guy, that ain't gonna happen, Stevens said. She won't let anyone connect to the outside world directly. I think she's afraid of people finding out about this place. Why are you here? I asked. I mean, I know she's family, but this place doesn't seem that amazing. Honestly, it's kind of creepy, with all the talk of me not being a girl, and the bunkhouse and the shared tub. I shivered. Stevens laughed. Yeah, I guess it does have a weird vibe. But you haven't seen the whole operation, yet. Leah has farms, manufacturing, child care. This is a stable community that has survived off the grid for almost 20 years. It can continue to survive indefinitely, as long as the numbers are stable. But if word gets out, and folks start flocking up here hoping to be saved, we will get overwhelmed all too easily. She has to be picky about who's allowed in. I guess that makes sense. I rolled my tight shoulders. But it doesn't make it any less creepy. Feels too much like a cult. I guess it's a good thing I have to leave. I'd better head out in the morning. Stevens shook his head. You aren't going alone. Let's spend a couple days getting our plan together and getting organized. Then we'll head west. If we figure out a good solution, or can get a big enough supply, you can come back with me. That would be a big supply, I said, my heart sinking. I'm only 17. I'd need to stockpile 60 years of this stuff. They call it shelf stable, but I don't know if it lasts that long. Maybe I can learn how to make more. Maybe. Shaking his head, Stevens got up and stepped to the head of the bed. He pulled his gun from the holster hanging from a peg. Handing it to me, he returned to his place on the bed. That's a revolver. If you're going to survive, here or out there, you need to be able to defend yourself. Tomorrow I'll show you how to shoot it, but for now, let's go through some basics. By dinner time, I'd learned to load, unload, and clean the gun. A gong sounded through the building, the low sound vibrating through my bones. That's the dinner bell, Stevens said. He rummaged in the toiletry bag on his bed and tossed a comb at me. Comb your hair and straighten your shirt. Leah expects everyone to look presentable at meals. Chapter 8. The room on the first floor was packed. I counted the tables, 12, and estimated 40 men and boys seated at them. There were no women or girls. They weren't kidding about needing girls, I whispered to Stevens as we entered. Stevens gave him a warning glance. The women are in the kitchen, he said, keeping his voice low. Leah has instituted some pretty strict gender roles. It's one of the reasons they don't have many girls. They hear about the system here and steer clear. Can't say I blame them. There are other preppers in these mountains. Then why are you here? I asked for what felt like the 100th time. And didn't she give me crap about my modern attitudes? They know me here. Stevens led the way across the room to an open bench. Anywhere else, I'd have to prove my worth before they'd let me join. With your skills, that doesn't seem like much of a barrier, I muttered. Besides martial arts, Stevens was an expert marksman, a master gardener, and he knew his way around a horse. And those were only the things I knew about him. I had no doubt Stevens had other skills. We sat at an empty bench, leaving room for another person on the end. Across the table, two rough-looking men, probably a father and son, glowered at us with identical expressions. A third man, much smaller and more civilized looking, sat down next to me. "Evening," he said, holding out a hand. "Chris Peterson." I shook awkwardly, introduced myself, then leaned back so Peterson could exchange pleasantries with Stevens. Then Peterson gestured to the men across the table. "This is Mr. Smith," he said, "and his son, Junior." Junior nodded, showing off his crooked teeth with a smile. "You gentlemen are new here," Peterson said, looking at me. "Just came up today," Smith said. He looked Stevens up and down. "Saw him at the checkpoint." "Pets." He sneered and looked away. I raised an eyebrow at Stevens but didn't say anything. "Now, Mr. Smith, you don't know anything about these gentlemen. They may be experienced hunters or fishermen. Or builders perhaps. Mechanics. You can't tell by looking." Peterson smiled pleasantly. "That one ain't got no calluses on his hands," Junior said, pointing at me. "He's a girl." Smith growled at his son, and the younger man ducked his head. "Junior got one thing right, Doc," he said to the small man, "boys got soft hands." "The boy," Stevens said, picking up his butter knife and looking at it, "is quite capable of taking care of himself. It wouldn't be a good idea to meet him in a dark alley, if you know what I mean." Smith snorted. "And you're an expert, old man?" Stevens locked eyes with Smith and smiled. It was a predatory smile, and Smith's eyes widened a fraction. "I am also quite capable of taking care of myself." They stared each other down until Peterson cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, please, we're all on the same side here." He made eye contact with each of them. Ms. Leo wouldn't have let them in if they couldn't contribute to the cause. "Did he call you Doc?" Stevens asked Peterson as the two Smiths sat back, glaring. "Doctor of what?" Peterson lifted a shoulder in a diffident shrug. "I am a surgeon." "You break it, he can put it back together," Smith said. The look on his face made me think he'd like to help break some of my things. But Peterson was a doctor, he might be able to help me. My black mood lifted a fraction. I glanced at the Smiths and decided to ask in private. No point in letting these gentlemen know my weakness. Women and girls entered the room, carrying large bowls and trays. A girl of about 12 poured water into my glass. When I smiled to thank her, she blushed and looked away. The women served roasted meat, rustic loaves of bread, fresh butter, and steamed vegetables. They set a platter at the end of each table, and the men grabbed each as soon as it touched the wooden tabletop. Smith used a wicked-looking hunting knife to slide 2 large slabs of meat onto his plate, then passed the platter to his son. The younger man took 2 more slabs, leaving 3 small pieces for the 3 of us. Without waiting, the men began hacking at their plates and shoving the food into their mouths. Dr. Peterson took one of the smaller slices and handed the tray to me. "Looks like venison tonight," Peterson said. "Have you had deer before?" I stared at the slice on my plate. "You mean this is real meat? From a living animal?" The two Smiths laughed. Junior nearly choked on the huge hunk of venison in his mouth, and his father had to pound him on the back. "You've never eaten natural meat before?" Doc asked. I shook my head and picked up my fork and knife to cut a small bite. I grew up in a housing block. We only got protein patties. Sometimes we'd get a roast for special occasions. I picked up the bite and sniffed it. It smelled similar to the protein patties, with a slight difference I couldn't quite pinpoint. I put the piece in my mouth and chewed. Everyone at the table watched me. The meat was chewy and had a strong flavor I wasn't accustomed to. No matter how long I chewed the stringy piece, I couldn't seem to break it down. Finally, I swallowed it, following the bite by chugging my water. The Smiths laughed. I grabbed the loaf of bread as it came by, ripping a chunk off as I'd seen the others do. I mopped up the meat juice with the bread, hoping it would prove I wasn't too girly to eat real meat. Before I'd gotten halfway through, Smith and Son got up abruptly and departed without a word. "Cut the meat across the grain," Stevens said, quietly. "It's easier to chew that way." Doc got up and moved around to the far side of the table. "More room over here. Plus, it's easier to chat." He gave Stevens another once-over. "You do look like you can take care of yourself. What's your specialty?" "Taekwondo is my preference, but I dabble in Shapalji and Krav Maga. I'm also certified in Sambo." Doc's eyebrows rose. "Sambo? And you dabble in Shapalji and Krav Maga? I see. Remind me to stay on your good side." He laughed and turned to me. "And you?" "I have a black belt in Taekwondo. Third Dan. Plus, Master Stevens has shown me how to defend myself using a combination of the others." I put my knife and fork down, the meat only half eaten. "You'd better learn to eat that if you're going to stay here," Doc said, pointing his fork at my plate. "Not only to maintain your strength, which you'll need, but also to show the locals you aren't a pet." He wrinkled his nose. "It's not a friendly designation." "So we'd gathered," Stevens said. "How long have you been here?" As Doc answered, Stevens casually put one hand in his lap. Moving slowly, he put a finger on my leg and tapped twice. In the dojon, a double tap was the signal for tapping out or surrendering to your opponent. Obviously here, it must mean something different. Remembering what Stevens had said earlier about the attitude toward outsiders, I took it as a warning to be careful what I said. I'd check with the master before asking Doc about insulin. While Doc told us about his practice in Gatlinburg, I worked on finishing the venison. Once I'd figured out what across the grain meant, I was able to cut and chew the remaining pieces. I didn't know if I'd ever enjoy venison, but it was edible, and it filled my stomach. Plus, protein didn't use insulin. Maybe if I ate enough, it would make my supply last longer. After dinner, Doc offered to show us around the settlement. Stevens cheerfully took him up on the deal. I considered bowing out, but I wasn't sure I wanted to be on my own around these people. Plus, Stevens gave me a look that I easily interpreted as a command to stay with them. We went back up to Stevens' room to get his pack. "Guess I'd better get used to keeping this on me," he said, glancing at my bag. "Might have to get me one of those." We met Peterson in the main room, which was now almost empty. Apparently, people here ate quickly and left as soon as they were done. Female laughter drifted from what I assumed was the kitchen. The women must eat there between serving and cleaning. It was odd that a woman like Leah would force other women into servitude. Doc saw me looking at the kitchen and shook his head. "You stay away from there, young man." He led the way into the airlock and pulled his pack over his face. "Don't get near any of those girls until you've been here long enough to know who to watch. If a girl starts paying attention to you, there are plenty like Smith, Jr., who won't be too happy." I pulled on my own filter. "I have a girlfriend," I said, then realized it wasn't true. "Not anymore. She was upstairs, with Dozer." "Dozer!" The darkness in my stomach swelled up into my chest. No Starla, no insulin, no hope. Maybe I should have stayed with Howard and died like everyone else in the city would. We walked across the meadow as the glow behind the clouds dropped to touch the tops of the mountains. That way must be west. I should just leave here and drive that way. Stevens might let me borrow the car. If I drove far enough, I should reach Albuquerque. Maybe I'd find someone there who knew how I could survive. "That's the girl's cabin," Doc said, pointing to another of the low wooden buildings. This one stood out because it had flowers planted in boxes beneath the windows. As we looked, The door opened and two young women wearing jeans and t-shirts came out. They glanced at the older men, then stared at me. One of them said something, and they both giggled and ran toward the bath. The shorter girl looked back over her shoulder when they reached the door, wiggling her fingers in our direction before she disappeared inside. "That's exactly what I'm talking about," Doc said. "You don't want to get the girls giggling." "But I didn't do anything," I said. "I was just standing here." Stevens laid a hand on my shoulder, and I bit my tongue. The sooner I could get out of here, the better. Chapter 9. I stayed out late, hoping to avoid any new guy hazing by staying out of sight. At Stevens' suggestion, I locked my laptop bag in the car, keeping only a single vial of insulin in my pocket. I had the skills to protect myself, but I didn't have any way to really safeguard my stuff. Limiting the potential for theft turned out to be a very wise plan. Although I waited until the curfew bell, my new roommates had waited up for me. Junior, and another guy named Rigo, sauntered up to my bunk as I unlocked the trunk at the foot of my bed. "What you doing, pet?" Rigo snarled. I glanced up, noting his location and Junior's. Rigo came closer, kicking my trunk. I said, "What are you doing, pet?" I ignored him, although I could feel his eyes burning into the middle of my back, right between the shoulder blades. Pocketing the trunk key, I stood, slowly. I was getting my toothbrush. I turned, hands down at my sides. "May I help you?" Rigo looked back at Junior, who smirked back at him. Putting a hand on his holster, he kicked my trunk again. "We have a problem with interlopers. We don't like them. They eat our food and lead more pets to us." I was surprised he knew the word interlopers, but I wisely declined to say that. "I haven't led anyone here. And I brought food with me." "Maybe you didn't hear me, pet," Rigo said. "We don't like interlopers." I shrugged. "Good thing I'm not planning on staying, then." Rigo's eyes flickered. He was clearly surprised to hear that and wanted to fight anyway. He recovered quickly. "What, so you can lead other pets up here? We don't need you to go blabbing our location all over the place." "I'm not going to tell anyone about your hideout. I just want to sleep and then get on my way tomorrow." I didn't care what Steven said about planning. I wasn't hanging around this nuthouse any longer than necessary. "I'll swear a vow of secrecy, if that helps." "Only dead men tell no tales," Junior said, clearly spouting a quote. "I don't think killing me is a good idea. My boss is Miss Leah's cousin." I hated to pull the teacher's pet card, but I felt like I was running out of options. Rigo snarled and reached for his gun. I stepped forward and threw a low block, slamming my forearm against his. The force of impact hurt my arm, but I ignored it. I grabbed his arm and twisted around behind him, pulling his hand up behind his back. "I really don't think pulling your gun is a good idea." Around the room, I heard numerous revolvers cock. I looked up to see Junior and 4 other young men pointing their weapons at me. I slid a half step to the left, and twisted Rigo's arm so he stood between me and the guns. Rigo whimpered. Then I pulled the pistol from Rigo's holster. "Now what?" I asked. "Stand down, morons," Rigo said, forcing a laugh. "I was just having a little fun. The pet here is cool." The other guys slowly lowered their weapons and put them away. Now that the first rush of action was over, my heart went into overtime. I breathed in through my nose, hoping to calm myself. When the guns were safely stowed, I released Rigo's arm. We locked eyes. Now what? I couldn't stay awake all night, and for all I knew, Leah would be happy to have Rigo take me out. He didn't seem like the sharpest stick in the bundle, although compared with Junior, he was a needle. but he might think no one would care if the new guy just disappeared. Stevens might even think I'd decided to head out to Albuquerque on my own. He didn't know me anything, and there was no doubt my presence here could complicate his life. He might be happy to see me leave. Decision made, I switched the gun to my other hand and pulled out the key to my trunk. I dragged it away from the foot of the bed, so it was between me and Rigo. Without taking my eyes off him, I squatted down and unlocked the trunk. It took me a couple tries to get the key into the lock without looking. Plus, my hands were slick with sweat and shaking. I yanked the lid up and pulled my bag out of the trunk. Rigo chose that moment to rush me. I guess he thought I couldn't see him over the lid. He lunged straight at me, leaping over the open trunk. The lid slammed shut. I dropped the bag and stepped back into a fighting stance, his gun still clutched in my left hand. Pivoting on one foot, I swung out of the way and let him sail past me. He stumbled when he hit the ground and slammed into the wall. I stepped back against the bunk, trying to keep my back to something at least semi-solid. Rigo scrambled up and turned to face me. I pointed the gun at him. "I don't think so." Rigo froze then smiled, although it looked kind of sickly. "That's your left hand. I bet you can't hit the side of a barn with that hand." A tiny tremor ran through his voice. "How do you know I'm not left-handed?" I asked. If he'd been paying attention, he would have noticed I unlocked the trunk with my right, but I was betting he wasn't that smart. I shrugged, trying to play it cool, but my shoulders jerking up and down must have looked comical. "Besides, you're so close, I could hardly miss. Pick up my bag." "What?" I pointed my right hand at my duffel. "Pick up my bag. You're going to carry it to the airlock for me. And then I'm going to leave. And everyone will be happy." Rigo looked around the room. Every one of those thugs looked like they'd be happy to pull out their own guns and shoot me, but so far, they hadn't thought to draw. I sidestepped along the bunk, urging Rigo forward with the gun. He ground his teeth and complied. I stepped behind as he picked up my bag, then guided him toward the door. When he moved forward, I stopped him. "Nope, stay there. I'll go in first." I reached around behind me to turn the knob and swung the door inward. Then I backed into the airlock, praying none of Rigo's buddies were running late. When I reached the outer door, I called back into the room. "Bring my bag now, Rigo. Drop it right there." I pointed to a spot just inside the airlock. When he'd done that, I told him to close the door. The second the door was closed, I yanked my pack off my belt and over my face. Then I pulled the outer door open, jamming my foot against it. That would keep the idiots inside from opening the inner door. At least I hoped they were smart enough to know letting the air out of their home would be a bad idea. I fumbled with the gun, my sweat-slick fingers sliding over the unfamiliar thing. I managed to get the revolving chamber open and dumped the bullets into my palm. I hadn't cocked it, so all 6 fell into my hand. I set the gun on the floor of the airlock, grabbed my bag and ran. I didn't need anyone accusing me of theft. I didn't know if the outer door would close on its own, but I didn't really care. Anything that slowed their pursuit was okay with me. I raced around to the delivery dock and opened the outer door on the smaller airlock. They hadn't locked it yet. The blowers ran, seeming to take forever to complete the cycle. I fiddled with the bullets in my hand, rolling them over each other. What little I knew about guns came from old Western movies, the couple hours with Master Stevens this afternoon, and from disarming exercises with other martial arts students. Of course, we used a prop gun for that. Maybe Master Stevens could give me an in-depth course. Now. The inner door finally popped open, and I burst inside. A woman screeched in alarm, stumbling back from a nearby shelf. She held a clipboard in one hand and a pencil in the other. I dropped my bag to shut the inner door and turned to her. You might want to lock that. Everyone should be inside for the night, right? She gaped at me. Yes. You're right, I should have locked up at curfew. I smiled. Luckily for me, you didn't. Say, can you do me a favor? Her lips curved up a little in response to my smile. I'd always had that effect on women, smile and they'd smile back. Right now, that was working in my favor. I guess so. You're the new boy, right? Just arrived today? I let my smile widen and stepped forward to hold out my hand. Gazing down into her eyes, I said, I'm Zane. Did I see you at dinner? The woman was old enough to be my mother, but as usual, that didn't seem to matter. She fluttered her eyelashes a little and sighed happily. I'm Alice. I brought bread to your table. I'm surprised you remembered me. I hadn't, but I wasn't going to tell her that. The bread was delicious, Alice. I held her hand just a second longer, then let go, pulling my hand back slowly. How can I help you, Zane? Alice giggled a little when she said my name. I had a little, let's call it a negative interaction. I winked at her. Was that going too far? No. She leaned in closer. With who? Guy named Rigo. She nodded. He's kind of hot under the collar. I'm not too surprised. She blinked at me. I'm kind of surprised you're not roughed up. Or worse. She gave me a bold once-over. You look just fine. Maybe the wink was too much after all. I didn't need a middle-aged woman crushing on me. Thanks. I had to disarm him. Can you return his bullets? Or leave them somewhere he'll find them? I don't want anyone to think I'd steal from him. I held out the handful of ammunition. She laughed. He's not going to tell anyone you disarmed him. That would be admitting weakness. She reached out and picked up the bullets one at a time, running her fingertips across my palm each time. I totally misjudged my flirting on this one. We had a bit of an audience, so they know what happened. He just needs to convince them to take his side. I left the gun in the airlock of the bunkhouse. He could hide it and claim you stole it. She put the bullets into her apron pocket and stepped closer to me. I stepped back. There's a camera in the airlock. As long as he doesn't convince whoever watches security to lie for him, I'm probably good. A thought pinged in my head. Oh, crap, Rigo's not the security guy, is he? Alice shook her head. No, that's Eli. He's too old to patrol anymore, so he watches the monitors. She pointed to a door off the storeroom. He's probably in there now, if you want to talk to him. Or you could spend a little more time with me. She put her hand on my chest, then slid it down to my hip. I yelped a little and stepped back. Thanks, but I gotta go see Master Stevens. But thanks for your help. I grabbed my bag and bolted into the house. I could hear her giggle before the door shut behind me. I took the steps up to the bedroom level 2 at a time. An oil lamp sat on the table in the main entry, and another burned on a table at the top of the stairs. The dim, flickering lights cast my shadow, huge and wavering against the walls. I hurried across the balcony and through the door at the end. When I knocked on Stephen's door, he called, "Come in." His voice sounded wide awake, so I turned the knob and opened the door. Dropping my bag inside the door, I shut it again and turned the key in the lock. Stephen sat in the chair by the window, another of those oil lamps on the table beside him. He reached out and twisted something, and the light brightened. What happened? Guy named Rigo tried to jump me. I took his gun, but his buddies were still armed, so I didn't think staying in the bunkhouse was a good idea. I stood before Stevens, head bowed. "Sit down," Stevens said. I kind of expected something like this. I didn't think weapons would be involved, though. "What did you do with the gun?" I sat cross-legged on the carpet and told him about the camera and leaving the pistol in the airlock. "I gave the bullets to a woman named Alice. She was doing an inventory or something in the storeroom." Stevens grinned. "I've met Alice. Very, friendly woman." I broke out in a sweat. "You aren't kidding." "She scared me more than Rigo with a gun." "You can sleep here tonight. Tomorrow, we're going to do some weapons training. After the chores, of course." Chapter 10. The gong rang at 5 a.m. I groaned and rolled over on the rough blanket I'd used as a mattress. I hadn't slept well on that hard, wooden floor. Master Stevens had offered me the bed, but he knew I'd let him have it. My respect for him, not to mention his age, made the offer pretty safe. Stevens lit the oil lamp on the table and pointed to the door. "Bathroom is 2 doors down the hall on the left. Make it quick. We're expected to be at our assigned locations in 10 minutes. "I don't know what my assignment is," I said. "Probably left a note on your bunk. That's what they usually do." Stevens shook his head and pulled a shirt on. "Don't worry about it, they're used to hazing newcomers get. Just go to the stables. They usually start new folks there." I got dressed, hurried in and out of the bathroom, then stumbled out the door. The stables stood on the far side of the meadow in front of the main building. Doc had pointed them out last night on our tour, so I knew where to go. I followed a mass of grumbling boys from the bunkhouse into the lighted stable, careful to stay well behind them. Junior and Rigo weren't in the group, so I relaxed a little. I kept my back to the wall, though, and an eye on the door. An older man handed out assignments. He seemed a little surprised to see me. "Torres?" he asked. I nodded. "Most newbies don't get here until later in the day." "Good job." He handed me a rake and pointed me deeper into the stable. "You're mucking." I spent the early hours cleaning stalls. Other boys in the crew fed the animals or took them out for exercise. In addition to horses, they had alpacas, sheep, and goats. "Don't they need packs?" I asked when one of the boys started to lead a few alpacas into the airlock. The kid laughed. "Can you imagine trying to get a pack onto an alpaca? Or a goat? He'd eat it." He shrugged. "These guys are adjusted to the smog. They probably die young. But what you gonna do? They're just animals." I patted the alpaca. "Poor thing. At least they get clean air when they're in here." At 7, another gong rang through the building. They must have them everywhere. I wondered who rang them but didn't get a chance to ask. Before the peal had died, the boys and the crew had racked their tools and hurried into the airlock. I put my rake away and put on my pack while I waited for them to leave the airlock so I could follow them out. I met Master Stevens in the main room, and we sat with Doc for breakfast. The women served oatmeal, scrambled eggs, and toast with sausage and coffee. I grimaced as I drank the bitter brew, but there was no cream or sugar in sight. Another reason to not stay here. I asked Alice for a glass of water, and she brought it with a wink and a smile. "Let's go out to the firing range after breakfast," Stevens said. "You don't have any other assigned duties yet, do you?" I shook my head. Rigo and Junior had just arrived and taken a table across the room. They looked our direction, and Rigo pointed his finger at me like a gun. I stared them down, but I didn't like the way they huddled together over their food, whispering. Stevens glanced over his shoulder at them. Maybe we should do some sparring, too. Just to let them know what they're going up against. If you think so, Master, I muttered, not wanting to draw more attention. Is there a dojon here? Stevens shook his head. No, but there's a training area. Over by the firing range. You'll see. After breakfast, he took me to the training ground. It was a cleared area in the shadow of the cliff. A firing range to one side held various paper and metal targets. A ring on the left surrounded a barren patch of ground that had been cleared of stones and brush. It wasn't as smooth as the mats at the dojon, and definitely not as easy to fall on. Stevens took off his jacket and unbuckled his holster. Hanging both on a fence post, he led the way into the rough ring. I looped my bag over the next post and followed him. Fighting with packs on was going to suck, but since the filters were new, it should be doable. Dirty filters would make breathing while exercising difficult at best. We bowed to each other and began with a few easy kicks and jabs. Then Stevens came at me like a freight train. I lost myself in the movement, kicking, jabbing, turning. I got more than a few hits on him. I suspected he was making me look good. Finally, he held up a hand. Sides heaving and sweat running down my face under the pack, I stopped and bowed to him. The master grabbed his gear, and we moved out of the ring. While we'd been sparring, a dozen or so men had gathered, watching. I saw Rigo and Junior in a covered space by a punching bag. They whispered together as we walked toward the firing range, then Junior tried kicking the bag. He missed and ended up on his butt. I choked back a laugh. In the firing range, Stevens showed me how to fire the revolver. It turned out to be both easier and harder than I expected. I have good eye-hand coordination, so I was able to hit the closer targets pretty easily. But as he moved the targets further away, my aim suffered. Finally, he called a halt. That's enough for today. We'll practice again tomorrow. Do we have to? I asked, trying not to whine. I'd really like to get out of here. I was hoping we'd leave today. Stevens looked at me, then glanced across the clearing. Rigo, Jr., and a couple other young men stood at the edge of the firing range. While his friends watched, Rigo practiced drawing his gun from his holster and firing rapidly from the hip. He hit the man-shaped cutout at least 5 out of 6 times. My stomach soured. That guy was dangerous. Noticing us watching, Rigo swaggered down the dirt path as he casually fed bullets into his gun. He spun the revolving chamber, then flipped the gun into his pocket. Giving me a lazy once-over, he strolled by. Nice shooting, he said, sarcasm dripping from the words. Have you hit the barn yet? I rolled my eyes and turned back to Stevens. Seriously, can we leave today? Stevens gazed at Rigo. Might not be a bad idea. As it turned out, we didn't leave that afternoon. On the way up the stairs after lunch, Master Stevens tripped over something and broke his ankle. When I went to look at the step, I saw Rigo pocketing something. He grinned at me. Too bad your bodyguard is going to be out of business for a while. I think Rigo tripped you on purpose. I told Stevens when I got to his room later that day. He lay in his bed with his ankle strapped up. Doc had said it and planned to do a plaster cast after the swelling went down. I tripped over a step, Stevens said. How could Rigo have caused that? I don't know. I stomped across the room and back. It's just the kind of things he'd do. I wanted to get out of here. I need to get out of here. Look, once Doc gets me plastered up, we can go. You'll have to do all the driving, but that's probably better anyway. Younger, sharper eyes. I feel like I'm running out of time. I picked up my messenger bag and pulled out my zippered pouch. It felt lighter. I gulped back fear, my hands shaking on the zipper. It's empty. I tipped the pouch over, shaking it, as if a vial could have gotten wedged inside and just needed the extra force of gravity to break free. Rigo stole my insulin. Why would he do that? Calm down, Steven said. Are you sure you didn't move it? To keep it safe? No. That bastard stole my medicine. I crammed the pouch down into my bag. I'm gonna go beat it out of him. Wait. Stevens used his don't mess with the master voice. Think about it. When could he have stolen your insulin? Did he even know about it? Did you leave it unattended? I thought back through the day. The pouch was full this morning, I said, breathing deeply through my nose to keep from hyperventilating. I put one vial in my pump and moved 5 of them to my jeans pocket. I shoved my hand into the pocket and pulled out the 5 vials. Not the safest place to keep them. If Stevens had landed a kick there when we sparred, I might have been down a few. But the plastic vials were sturdy, and obviously keeping it on my body had been a good move. The only time he could have gotten it was when we were sparring. I hung my bag on the fence post, near your belt and gun. It didn't look like anyone touched my weapon, Stevens said. But there were a number of spectators gathered around. I hate to say it, but Rigo and Junior were too far away. Stevens locked eyes with me. Well, maybe they got one of their friends to do it. I paced around the room, anger building in the pit of my stomach. Don't they know this is murder? Without that insulin, I'm dead. It just won't be obvious until next Thursday. I guess that's all the more reason for us to get on the road as soon as possible, Stevens said. Maybe that was their intention. I'll have a word with Leah. She won't put up with this kind of behavior. Whoever did it will be out on their ear. Go find Doc, will you? Chapter 11. You can't go, Doc said. What do you mean we can't go? I demanded. You can't keep us here. Not you. Doc glanced at me. You can go if you want. Stevens has to stay here. Not to be ungrateful, but I'll echo Zane's statement, Stevens said. You can't keep us here. You're right, I can't. Doc put his stethoscope back into his little black bag. It looked exactly like the doctor's bag in the old Western movies I'd seen as a kid. But traveling across the country right now could kill you. A broken ankle is going to kill me? Stevens shook his head. I find that hard to believe. Besides, I'm going to die someday. Better to do it helping my young friend, than to just waste away out here in the sticks. I blinked. That wasn't what he'd said just 2 days ago when I'd asked him why we were leaving DC instead of helping people. I don't want you to kill yourself helping me. You told me yourself that you have a history of thrombosis. Doc said. Without your medication, spending days in a car after an ankle break could kill you. Stevens waved that away. Wait a minute, I said. There's some medicine you're supposed to be taking? Then we definitely need to go. We can look for yours, too. Where's it made? Hang on. Doc hollered. I understand Zane's need to find insulin. I do. And I agree he should go to Albuquerque to try to find it. But Joss, you can stay here and do fine. We have aspirin. That was the old-time treatment for blood clots. I can guarantee you Leah isn't going to let you take a stockpile with you, though. We'll find more. He just needs enough to get us there. They have aspirin everywhere, right? My voice increased in volume as I got more agitated. It's not just the aspirin. Doc grabbed my arm. Long-distance travel, especially long hours in the car, like you're going to do, is a very bad idea. Enough, Stevens said. Doc, I appreciate your counsel, but my mind is made up. Zane and I will leave tomorrow. In the meantime, could you ask Ms. Leah to meet with me? I have a matter I wish to discuss with her. Shaking his head, Doc gathered his things and left the room. I pulled the chair next to the bed and sat down. Maybe I should go alone, I started. No, Stevens cut me off. We started this journey together, and we'll see it through together. I've always wanted to visit Albuquerque. This is my only chance at that. I started to argue, but he held up his hand. This conversation is over, Zane. My mind is made up. You don't get to make health decisions for me. Not yet, anyway. I'm not that old. Who's old? Leah's raspy voice seemed to fill the room. I jumped up, staring at the woman in the doorway. I hadn't even heard the door open. Leah, thank you for coming to see me. Stevens gestured to the chair I had just vacated. Please, sit down. I moved toward the door, but Stevens stopped me. This concerns you, Zane. Leah Saturday. She looked Stevens over, her beady eyes traveling over him from head to foot. Did a number on that leg, now didn't you? You might want to have someone take a look at the second to top stair, Leah, Stevens said. I'm not normally this clumsy. I knew it. I cried. No, Stevens said before I could continue. He glared at me. I believe that step may be a bit higher than the others. Not something that can be fixed easily, but definitely something that can hurt an unsuspecting person. The old woman nodded. It's always been the wrong size. My dad built this cabin, and he didn't cotton to measuring. The tread is thicker on that one, so it's higher. It keeps newcomers on their toes. It also breaks their ankles, Stevens said. I sank down on the floor by the foot of the bed. If the step had always been the wrong height, I couldn't blame that on Rigo. But there was still the issue of my missing vials. I opened my mouth, but Stevens beat me to the punch, again. The real reason I asked you up here, Stevens was saying, is because someone appears to have, misplaced Zane's insulin. He had a 4-week supply, but it is no longer in his messenger bag. We believe it disappeared while we were sparring this morning. That was the only time his bag was unattended. We were hoping you could look into it. Leah's face went still for a moment. Then she took a deep breath. I will have Doc investigate. We don't permit theft. Especially not theft of medication. Hey, maybe your surveillance guy could help out, I said, suddenly remembering the cameras I'd spotted near the training ground. How long does he keep the raw feed? Leah glanced over at me as if she'd forgotten my existence. The cameras around the training ground are focused outward, not on the ring. Besides, those cameras aren't operating at this time. We're not worried about an attack from that direction. Then why are they even there? With the cliff, no one is going to get into your compound from that side. Surely, they didn't waste resources, even electronic ones. She stared at me, her face and eyes cold. That's why those cameras aren't running right now, young man. She turned back to Stevens. I'll see what we can find out. Standing, she turned to leave. At the door, she turned back. I'm sorry this happened to you, Joss. I will have someone fix the step. Rest assured, anyone doing anything unethical or unwise will be dealt with. With a hard stare at me, she left. What did she mean? I asked. She doesn't want you accusing anyone or poking around, Stevens said. I understand why. She needs to keep this place running smoothly and can't have people stirring up trouble. But it seems like she's hiding something. Like what? I asked. Do you think she knows who took my insulin? Stevens shook his head. I didn't say that. But she obviously doesn't want you nosing around in the video surveillance. He glanced sharply at me. And don't you go doing it. She can kick us out if we mess with things she doesn't want us to see. We're leaving anyway, I muttered. Yes, but do we want to leave with supplies and our vehicle, or do we want to be kicked down the side of the mountain with only the clothes on our backs? Doc grabbed my arm as I left the main room after dinner that night. May I have a word with you, young man? He didn't wait for me to reply but steered me through a door at the back of the room, under the stairs. We stepped into a hallway that mirrored the one upstairs, except without the skylights. Stevens took a second to light a candle on a shelf near the door. He headed down the corridor, his shadow bouncing across my chest and face as he walked. At the far end of the hallway, he opened a door on the left and stepped back for me. The room looked like a standard doctor's office, complete with cushion-topped metal table, rolling stool and a glass-fronted cabinet. A metal cupboard with a lock took up the back wall of the room. The smell of bleach permeated the room. Doc gestured to the table. I hoisted myself up on the table. I don't think I need a checkup, document. That's not why you're here. Doc pulled the stool away from the wall and sat down. I want to encourage you to leave Mr. Stevens here. Go to Albuquerque. I can even recommend someone to accompany you, if you feel the need of protection. The boys aren't all jerks like Rigo. In fact, there's a young man who would be as happy as you to escape his attention. Why do you want me to leave Master Stevens here? I asked. Exactly what I told you before, he said. Spending 3 or more days in a car, at his age, with a recent break in his history? No, bad idea all the way around. If we still had access to some of the drugs from the colonies, that would be one thing. But I don't have any of those. Maybe you can find some and bring them back? I'm not sure I'm coming back, I said, slowly. I don't really like it here. Ms. Leah doesn't like me. And no matter how much insulin I find, someday I'll run out. I need a long-term solution. Doc nodded, his face thoughtful. That's some mighty clear long-range thinking, Mr. Torres. But, are you willing to be of assistance to us? Perhaps you can take a team with you, and they can bring some supplies back to us. Why don't you just send a team? I asked. You don't need me. Believe it or not, Mr. Torres, most of these young men have never been out of the Smokies. I have suggested we send some parties out, but Ms. Leah is afraid our boys won't survive. You're exactly the kind of person they need. Someone who knows how the world works. Someone with your, negotiating skills. My negotiating skills? When did he see me negotiate anything? I've seen the way every woman in this place responds to you, Mr. Torres. You have charm. I've also seen some of your videos, believe it or not. You're exactly who we need. If you say so. I eyed him, wondering which of my videos he saw. If you've seen my stuff, I can't believe you think I'm mature enough to lead a team, I blurted out. Doc smiled. I wasn't. But now I am. You're perfect. I climbed the steps to Stephen's room, pondering Doc's words. What had I done since I got here that would make him think I'm mature? Or capable of leading a scavenging team? Should I take on that kind of responsibility? Or should I let Master Stevens risk his life following our original plan? With only 5 days of insulin left, I'd better make up my mind, fast. Chapter 12. The next morning, the gong rang way too early. I hadn't slept well, so my eyes ached, and my stomach was in knots. I still hadn't decided what to do about Doc's proposal. Master Stevens tossed fitfully in his bed. I put a hand on his forehead. He was running a fever. I'd better find Doc before I headed to the stables. I scrambled into my clothes and to the bathroom. When I reached the balcony, the room below was full. Why were the men here? Did the older guys meet here in the morning while the boys were doing the chores? But the boys were here, too. And one glance at the clock told me why. We'd been woken up an hour early. What was so important it had to be discussed at 4 in the morning? From my vantage point on the balcony, I could see the room was packed. I climbed about halfway down and took a seat on the steps. From here I could hear dozens of whispered conversations. No one seemed to know why we'd been summoned. The smell of baking bread wafted in from the kitchen. Clearly, the women started work well before the men. A hush fell over the room, and every head in the place turned toward the balcony. Rather than twist around in my seat, I stood and leaned against the back wall. From here, I could see Leah and Doc's heads and shoulders. Leah stepped forward. "Eli is dead." Her bald announcement was met with gasps. Who the heck was Eli? I had heard the name somewhere. From my place on the stairs, I could see into a corner of the kitchen. Several women gathered near the door, straining to hear the announcement. Then it clicked. Alice had mentioned Eli when she'd come on to me in the kitchen. Eli was the guy who monitored the surveillance cameras. From what both she and Leah had said, he was old, so his death shouldn't be too much of a surprise. Maybe they had some kind of early morning memorial when someone died? What happened? Someone yelled up from the main room. We believe he accidentally overdosed on his insulin. That dropped his blood sugar too low, and he went into a coma. Since he was alone in the camera room, no one noticed until this morning, and it was too late. Doc answered the question. In his hand, he held a small plastic cylinder, identical to the one I'd snapped into my pump this morning. Oh, crap. We called you here, because without Eli monitoring the cameras, we all need to be extra vigilant. How do you know he wasn't poisoned? Someone yelled. Doc shook his head. It wasn't poison. I'm sure it was a mistake in dosage. His blood sugar was practically non-existent. Leah held up her hands, and silence dropped instantly. No more speculation. Eli clearly made an error, and we now mourn the passing of a good and faithful servant. Be on watch. With recent events in the outside world, we must be more careful to protect our home. Now, you're dismissed to do your chores. As the muttering crowd pushed and shoved out of the room, I raced up the steps, 2 at a time. As I ran across the balcony, a shout went up. Hey, he's trying to hurt Ms. Leah. Rigo, of course. I skidded to a halt beside Document. A crowd surged toward the stairs. My heart went into overdrive, and I fought the urge to run. Before I could do or say anything, 2 huge hands clamped onto my arms from behind. Watch his feet, he fights dirty. Rigo called. Everyone, chores. Now. Leah roared over the din. No wonder her voice sounded like sandpaper. She looked up at the man holding me. Smith. Let go of the boy and get to work. Doc and I will be fine. And send Rigo to muck out the stalls. He needs to learn when to keep his mouth shut. She turned to Document. Bring him to the office. Leah swept down the stairs. Doc and I trotted after her, hard-pressed to keep up with the older woman. When she reached the main floor, the crowd parted like magic to let her through. As we passed through the crowd, I heard mutters. Someone spit, barely missing my shoe as we walked. Doc glared, but I ducked my head and kept my eyes on the ground, watching for movement in my peripheral vision. An arm swiped out at me, but I blocked it easily. A yelp from the crowd made me feel a little better. We followed Leah through the same door Doc and I used last night. Light streamed from the first door on the right, and when we reached it, we stepped inside. The curtains were open, and the oil lamp on the table flickered against the pre-dawn darkness. Leah shook out a match and dropped it into an ashtray on the huge mahogany desk. Bookshelves lined 2 walls. A wood stove sat in the corner, cold. 2 upholstered armchairs stood before the desk. Sit. Leah pointed to one of the chairs. I sat on the right, and Doc took the other seat. He toyed with the vial he'd been carrying. That's mine, I said, pointing at the vial. One of the ones stolen from my bag. Did you find the rest? We did, Doc said, when Leah nodded to him. Suppose you tell us what's really in these vials. Drugs? Yeah, a drug called insulin. There's a label. Don't be insolent, boy, Leah growled. I held up both hands. I'm not. That's my insulin. I need it to survive. Can I have it back? It can't be insulin, Doc said, peering at the tiny label. Yeah, it is. I'm pretty sure that's what you use to treat diabetes. I let sarcasm drip from my words. Leah grabbed a yardstick leaning against her desk and slapped it down on my leg. Hard. Hey! I yelped. Answer the doctor's question. Leah swiped the yardstick again. I grabbed it as it whistled through the air and yanked it out of her hand. She cried out when I pulled it out of fingers, as if she'd gotten a sliver. I hope she did. Stop. I leapt to my feet and broke the yardstick over my leg. I am not one of your worshippers. I'm not going to just sit here and let you hit me. And I don't care if you kick me out, I'm leaving anyway. Leah's face had turned purple and her eyes narrowed to slits. Doc chuckled. Finally, someone able to stand up to you, Leah. Maybe we should keep him after all. The old woman turned her rage on Doc, but he just shook his head. You know that doesn't work on me, he said. You need me more than I need you. He turned back to me. Sit down, Zane. We want to understand why your insulin killed Eli. He's been a diabetic for years. He knows how to measure his insulin. It was an overdose? I asked. When Doc nodded, I continued. Are you sure it wasn't on purpose? What, a suicide? Doc shook his head. I don't think so. Besides, he only injected 1 dose. It shouldn't have been enough to kill him. He injected 1 dose? I repeated. From that vial? But it's empty. Doc looked at me as if I was an idiot. Yes, 1 dose. That's not 1 dose, I said. That's a full day's insulin. Read the label, it's super condensed and shelf stable. Intended for a pump, not an injection. I lifted my shirt to show him my pump. Doc closed his eyes. Of course. Eli never had a pump. He always used the older, less concentrated insulin. He must not have realized this was much stronger. He looked at Leah. A tragic accident. But what was he doing with my insulin? I turned to Leah. Did you know he stole it? Do you have the rest? I need it. Leah raised her chin. I don't condone theft. She looked at document. Give the boy his medicine. The sooner he leaves here, the better. I stared at her. Are you serious? He stole my insulin, and you're kicking me out? Eli is dead. There is nothing more to do. See yourselves out. She picked up some papers on the desk, ignoring us. Doc got up, leading me to his office. I'm glad you stood up to her, but don't push it. She is untouchable here, and she won't let you challenge her authority. We need to leave. Today. We? I asked. Are you coming with me? Doc nodded. Yes. I need to replenish my stores of medicines, while I can. I may as well do that and get you what you need at the same time. I kind of feel like I owe you that much. He handed me a small cardboard box. Inside the box, the remaining vials of insulin rolled around. I picked up a couple vials and looked at them. The seals were unbroken, and apart from the empty vial Doc had showed me in Leah's office, they were all here. Did you throw away the empties? Eli must have. There weren't any in his desk drawer. He looked at me, puzzled. Why? Do you need them? I shrugged. I just figured they might come in handy if, when, I find a source or a way to create more. Doc's lips twisted. That's positive thinking. Okay. I need to pack my gear, then we can get going. Where's your stuff? Oh, crap, that reminds me, I said. Master Stevens is running a fever. Is that normal? We headed out of the office, the box cradled in my arms. It might mean an infection. I'll take a look at him. Is your stuff in his room? I nodded. When we got upstairs, Master Stevens was awake. Doc checked his temperature and listened to his lungs. Then he handed 2 bottles to Stevens. I've got some antibiotics here, and an anticoagulant. 1 of each, twice per day. I thought you had me on aspirin, Stevens said. That was all you had. Doc looked uncomfortable. I did. With no opportunity to replenish supplies, I have to triage each case. In my estimation, you didn't need the stronger medication. Based on your current symptoms, I reevaluated my diagnosis, and I want you to take this. I'm going to fly Zane out to Albuquerque. There are several large medical manufacturing facilities out there. I'm hopeful I'll be able to stockpile a lot more medicine. Wait, did you say fly? I butted in. You have a plane? Doc nodded. Yeah. Fuel is hard to come by, so we have to be judicious in its use. Just like with the medication, need to triage. I did some research last night, and I think your trip to New Mexico is my best opportunity to replenish my supplies. I was going to offer to take you this morning. Eli just pushed my hand. Great, I'll get my stuff packed. Stevens sat up in bed. Do you have any crutches I can borrow? You are staying here, Doc said, pushing Stevens back down in the bed. Flying in your condition is definitely contraindicated. I'm going to start in 4 to keep you hydrated. I'll have Eleanor check on you. She's going to have you get up and move around every few hours. We'll get some compression stockings on you, too. If all goes well, I should be back in a week, or 2 at the latest. But Eleanor is more than capable of caring for you. I'll check on you when I return. While the old guys argued, I packed up the few things I'd left out. I transferred the vials of insulin to my little padded pouch and slid it back into my laptop bag. Why are you packing your gear, Zane? Stevens asked. Doc says you'll be back next week. I'm not coming back, Master, I said. Leah doesn't want me here, and Rigo is a prick, and frankly, I don't want to stay here. I wish you could come with me, though. I'm going to grab my gear. Zane, if you have a weapon, bring it. Doc gave me a meaningful look. Joss, I'll see you in a week or 2. He left, closing the door behind him. I know you don't like it here, Stevens began, but I held up a hand to cut him off. It's not just that. I perched on the side of the bed. Leah has basically given me the heave-ho. Old Eli stole my insulin and gave himself an accidental overdose. Stevens sucked in a breath. Did you know him? I asked. At his head shake, I continued. He was old, I guess, but Doc thinks folks will blame me for bringing newfangled drugs into the compound. I'd rather leave now than get chucked out later. Or murdered while I sleep. I stood up and turned away. Look, thanks for everything, Master. You saved my butt more times than I can count by letting me sleep in the dojon, and by letting me train with you. Not to mention bringing me here. I owe you everything. I blinked hard, trying to stop the tears that threatened to spill. Behind me, I heard a sniff. I turned to see Stevens wiping his eyes. He'd always been one to get emotional. You've been like a son to me. You showed up just a few weeks after my Rietta died. You gave me someone to focus on. Then, when the boys went upstairs, you filled the gap. He grabbed a handkerchief off the bedside table and blew his nose. Maybe when I'm up and around again, Doc will bring me out to visit you. Where will you go? I swiped the tears off my face, shaking my head. I don't know. I'll see what these people in New Mexico know. Maybe they could use someone with computer skills. That would keep me close to the production source, so I won't run out. A knock on the door startled us, and I spun around. Doc stuck his head in. Ready? Give us another minute, Stevens said. I'll meet you downstairs, Zane, Doc said and withdrew. Grab my bag, Stevens said. The small one by the desk. I lifted the smaller duffel bag and handed it to Stevens. It must have been inside his larger bag. I didn't remember seeing it before. He unzipped it and dug through. Do you still have the gold I gave you? Holy crap! I hadn't even checked if the gold was still there when I discovered my insulin missing. I guess that showed what was important in my life. I pulled open my bag. Yeah, it's down here. Under the computer. I guess Eli didn't have any use for that. Or he only had a couple minutes to get what he needed. If he lifted the insulin when we were sparring, it had to be quick. Stevens held out another velvety bag. Take the rest of it. What? No, I don't need your gold. I pulled the little drawstring bag out of my messenger bag. In fact, I need to give this back to you. No, listen to me. Stevens' voice was low and intense. He locked eyes with me. I don't have any use for gold. Eli didn't bother stealing it, so clearly, it's worth almost nothing here. Leah will take care of me. But you're going out into the void. You need something to bargain with. You also need this. He handed me the revolver I'd practiced shooting the day before. Master, Zane. Take them. His eyes brimmed over, and tears ran down his face. It's all I can do for you now. Chapter 13. We drove to a little airfield near a place called Pigeon Forge. Like most airfields outside the service area border, it had been abandoned decades ago. But one of the asphalt runways looked smooth. Does someone fix that thing? I asked Doc as we drove across the rutted asphalt. He nodded. There are a couple hobbyists up here. We keep the one runway in good repair, and leave the rest of the airport looking terrible so no one will investigate. He gestured back at the overgrown road we'd just traveled. We dodged around a sapling that had burst through the asphalt. There's a narrow strip between that hangar, he pointed to a huge, dilapidated building on the right, and the one good runway. The rest of the apron is left to crumble. As if proving his statement, the car jolted over one last hump, and rolled onto a smooth piece of paving. He turned right, angling toward the hangar. Stopping at a downed tree, he turned to the tall, thin man crammed in the back seat. Tim, you know the drill. Tim got out of the car and dragged the large branch out of the way. Doc squeezed the car past as soon as Tim had moved it far enough. We drove a few more yards, and he stopped the car in front of the hangar. Opening the door, he climbed out. "Help me with the door, will you?" I followed Doc to the building. A huge door hung on metal cross beams well above our heads. Doc grabbed what appeared to be a loose piece of siding and rotated it aside, exposing a lock. He pulled a key from his pocket and pushed it into the lock. The key rotated easily, despite the rusty appearance of the plate. Leaving the key in the cylinder, he grabbed a vertical handle and nodded to an identical one about 10 feet away. "Grab that and on my count, pull to the right. 3, 2, 1, pull." I leaned against the handle, using my body weight to get the door rolling. Once it started moving, it shifted easily. We pushed it aside, until the whole front of the building was open. "Grab your bags, Zane, and stack them here." Doc pointed to a relatively clear space to the side of the asphalt. While I did that, Tim trotted up and they went inside. The interior was dim, lit only by grimy skylights. 3 small aircraft sat in the dark, their colors impossible to determine. Doc headed to the one on the left. "Tim, help me roll this out." "Zane, when we get the plane out, put the car inside, shut the door and lock it." The aircraft they pushed out of the hangar looked like a child's toy. A bulbous, mostly transparent compartment hung between 2 long wings that were covered in solar panels. 3 spindly struts held it up off the ground, with tiny wheels allowing easy movement. The exterior was painted blue and gray, in a mottled pattern that probably helped camouflage it in the sky. Once it was outside, I moved the little car inside the hangar and pushed the door shut. It moved easily on well-lubricated wheels. I slid it into the closed position with a little more effort and turned the key in the lock. I handed the key to Doc and loaded my duffel bag into the cargo net under the plane. Then we pushed the little craft across the asphalt to the cleared runway. Tim stopped to reposition the branch after we got the plane past. "Are you sure this thing will hold all 3 of us?" I asked. "It looks so, fragile." "Why do you think I weighed you before we left?" Doc said. "Usually Tim and I travel alone, but we bring lots of stuff back with us. You put us close to our maximum, but we're still good. The plane has a good charge, and you didn't bring much weight, so I think we're good." I was worried when Stevens mentioned gold. That stuff is heavy. Luckily, I don't have very much. But hopefully enough to get me what I needed. The passenger compartment of the plane was crowded. Tim folded the right side seat forward and climbed into the space behind it. He folded his long legs up into an almost impossible angle, then stretched out crosswise on the narrow bench built into the back wall. Doc folded the seat upright and climbed across into the left seat. "Jump in, Zane, we're burning daylight." With one more look at the spindly legs and tiny motor, I took a deep breath and climbed into the bubble. Doc showed me how to strap in, handed me a headset, and then he started hitting switches. The little engine buzzed to life, and the craft started moving forward down the runway. We picked up speed surprisingly quickly, and soon the craft bobbed up into the air. Doc circled the airfield as we gained altitude. I stared down it through the transparent material at my feet, watching the hangar and trees shrink down to miniature size. We try to stay over this area while climbing. Once we're at altitude, the engine noise decreases substantially. But while we're making a lot of noise, it's smarter to stay in these uninhabited areas. Folks here are used to hearing the planes. Once we'd gotten high enough, Doc lowered the nose, and the plane flattened out. Now that we're at altitude, we can use the engine to pressurize the cabin and we can take our packs off. Pointing the plane directly west, according to the built-in compass, he flipped a few more switches. The engine noise decreased, and we sailed effortlessly across the landscape. "This is a combination of ultralight and regular aircraft," Doc said. "Uses a combo of combustion engine and electrical power. It can do longer distances, but it will still take us a while to get to New Mexico. We'll need to stop at an airfield I know of in Oklahoma and spend the night there. The wings have solar panels, but it doesn't soak up enough juice while we're flying. We'll plug in and recharge overnight. For a while, I just gazed out the windows at the rolling hills below us. As we left the mountains behind, the smog closed in below us, leaving us in a rolling sea of white clouds. Doc passed the time by showing me how the plane worked and letting me steer for a while. Tim snored in the back seat. How he could sleep, I don't know. About 6 hours later, Doc flipped a switch, and the engine noise got loud again. Time to land this thing. The plane dropped toward the clouds, plunging into the white and gray froth. I held my breath, certain we'd hit the ground before we could see it. The ride got rougher, bouncing us around inside the small cabin. In the back, Tim shifted restlessly. We popped out of the cloud cover into a dreary twilight landscape. The ground stretched out below us, flat and barren. Straight lines cut across the dusty ground, broken here and there as if they'd been erased by a giant pencil. The ride smoothed out a bit, more swooping and less jolting. More than once, the bottom seemed to drop out beneath us, and we fell for a few heart-stopping moments before another gust would swing us back up. Some turbulence, Doc said cheerfully. Good thing it isn't tornado season. He grinned as he wrestled the plane closer to the ground, whooping when the plane swung wildly. Tim's fingers gripped the back of my seat, his white buckles only a few inches from my head. I glanced back at him, but his eyes were closed, and he mumbled something under his breath. As we got closer to the ground, the turbulence abated, a little. The straight lines resolved into roads and highways. The erased parts were piles of rubble where the road had been torn up. What did that? I pointed down at one. Doc glanced down past our feet. Tornado, he said with a nod. They really rip through here from, June to May, I'd guess. I stared at him. June to May? That's all year. He nodded. Yeah, used to be a seasonal thing, but they can show up at any time these days. Much less likely right now, but we'll be using the underground facility. The what? I asked. Doc shook his head. Gotta focus on landing. Watch and learn. He aimed the plane at the ground, or at least that's what it felt like. The huge, dusty ground swooped up to meet us. We landed on a patch of road that had clearly been repaired many times. This used to be the main highway, Doc said just before we touched down. The wheels hit the asphalt and the plane rolled along the highway, rattling everything inside so loudly we couldn't talk. We rolled down the road, slowing to a walking pace. Finally, near a turnoff, we stopped. We'll get out here, Doc said, pulling his pack on when he removed the headset. We'll let it recharge until it starts to get dark, then we'll roll it into the underground. I looked around, but all I could see were dusty fields and an abandoned farmhouse. I pulled my pack on over my face and checked to make sure Tim had his on as well. Then we climbed out of the plane. Tim grabbed my duffel bag and a big case snapped to the underside of the plane and started toward the farmhouse. What's the underground? I asked Doc as we walked along the highway, stretching our legs. He pointed back over his shoulder. See that little road? It leads down into that gully. We can park the plane under the highway bridge. It's been reinforced to provide shelter for aircraft in transit. There aren't a lot of us still flying, but enough to have a system. Plus, we can plug it in. There are solar panels in the bridge. We turned and started back toward the plane. Tim is setting the beacon in the farmhouse to occupied. That way, anyone who flies over here will know there's no space in the hangar tonight. You run the risk of drawing attention to your location, but pilots have an unwritten code. It's pretty safe. There are sleeping accommodations in the basement of the farmhouse. Everyone does a bit of maintenance when they use the place, as payment. He stared at the big building. Tim stepped out onto the porch and waved. We also make note of any maintenance issues, so people know what to work on. Come on. With that, he led the way off the highway and up the short driveway to the farmhouse. Tim, a man of few words, nodded to Doc and me as we climbed the steps. Might storm tonight, he said, staring off to the west. Through the familiar haze of smog, we could see clouds piling up along the horizon. We'll move the plane now, Ben, Doc said. The three of us walked back to the plane. Doc climbed inside and pulled a release. Something clicked. Fold the wings, Tim told me. He walked to the far side, unclamped a couple latches on the underside and folded the wing up vertical. Feeling around on the underside of the wing, I found a latch. I ducked my head and looked underneath, trying to figure out how to unsnap it. Finally, I got the latch undone, and lifted the wing. It folded smoothly upward, until the little plane looked like a triangle. When the two wings touched at the tips, they snapped together with a click. With Doc inside steering, Tim and I pushed the little vehicle off the highway. A dirt pathway paralleled the road for a few yards, then it started to dip. It wound down into a shallow gully. When we reached the bottom, Doc turned the plane and we rolled up to a big door. A hangar was built into the space beneath the road. Tim ran ahead to open the door, then trotted back to help me push the plane inside. A smooth concrete floor, walls and roof gave just enough space for the folded plane. While Doc locked the cockpit, Tim pulled a cord out of the plane's rear compartment and plugged it into the panel on the wall. Then we stepped outside. Tim rolled the door shut again, locking it with the integrated combo lock, and the three of us headed back up the track. In the few minutes we'd spent parking the plane, the sky had darkened. The clouds along the horizon surged toward us, and a sprinkling of fat raindrops spattered onto us. We clattered up the porch steps and into the brooding wreck of a house. Boards across the windows allowed no light into the space. Doc led us across the room past a stairway and to the door set in the wall beneath it. Grab your bag, Zane, he said. We're spending the night in the shelter. I picked up my bag and followed Tim down the narrow, wooden stairs. He snapped on a flashlight, the beam illuminating the dusty underside of the steps above us. Cobwebs hung from rusted nails and rough planks. Dust poofed up as we tromped down the stairs. Ahead of Tim, Doc sneezed. Psychosomatic, Doc muttered, barely audible through his pack. At the bottom of the stairs, a thick door led into a concrete room with red emergency lights glowing. Shut the door, Zane, so we can run the circulator. I shut the door behind me with the whomp and hiss of a heavy-duty airlock door. Immediately, fans began blowing, and a soft breeze blew my hair off my sweaty forehead. The red lights flashed to green, then went out. A yellowish glow grew slowly, illuminating the room. 3 sets of bunks lined 3 walls of the room. The 4th wall held a kitchenette. A table and 4 chairs stood near the sink. A narrow door led to a tiny bathroom. Home, sweet home, Tim said, setting down the plastic case he'd carried down the steps. He dropped onto one of the lower bunks. Doc unsnapped the latches of the plastic case and pulled out 3 fabric bags, each about 6 inches on a side. He tossed one to Tim and the second to me. Sleeping bags, he said. Pick a bunk. We've also got food in here. Tim, turn on the radio. See if you can find anyone transmitting. While I heated some water for the dehydrated meals, Tim scanned the radio band. He found nothing but static. Doc pulled another device from a cabinet near the door and handed it to Tim. Try the ham frequencies, he said. While we ate, Tim and Doc worked their way through every radio frequency on the dial. Finally, they gave up. Nobody out there, tonight, Tim said. Chapter 14. I slept fitfully. The wind came up after we'd turned in. It roared so loudly we could hear it inside the shelter. I tossed and turned, sure the place would crash down on top of us. I finally gave up and got out of bed, but there was nowhere to go. I paced around the tiny room for a few minutes, then went back to my bunk. Finally, around 3 in the morning, the wind died down. In the morning, Doc woke us around 6. "I let you sleep in," he said. After that night, we all needed it. I rolled out of the bunk. "Was that a tornado?" I asked. Tim laughed, a short, rusty bark. "If you had to ask, it ain't." He headed into the tiny bathroom. I turned to document. He smiled. "He's right. That was just a storm. A tornado. Believe me, you don't want to experience one of those. Start some water, will you? We have oatmeal to cook." When we'd eaten and packed up our few things, we put on our packs, and Doc led the way upstairs. We spent a couple hours repairing the floor in the entry. Don't want anyone to fall through. Make sure it looks old and worn, though. We also don't want it to look like anyone is in here regularly. After we replaced the broken planks, we scattered dirt over the floor so a casual observer wouldn't know we'd been inside. We moved a few branches off the path near the hangar, and Doc set me to sweeping debris off the runway while he and Tim pushed the plane back out. When we'd finally loaded up, it was well after 10. Takeoff went smoothly, and less turbulence rattled our teeth on our way up. Once above the clouds, the air smoothed out, and we sailed westward. In New Mexico, we landed on a wide strip in the desert near the abandoned city of Albuquerque. "This used to be a military base," Doc said. "About 40 years ago, almost everyone left in Albuquerque was moved to Phoenix. The few folks who stayed behind live near the river. Then Exocorp moved in some big production facilities. The one that makes your insulin is one of them. They had housing here on the old base for their workers, but most of the work was done by industrial robots. We may find no one is left." We parked the plane in one of the huge, old hangars. They were open on the side facing the runway, so we moved the craft deep into the dim, cavernous space. Doc locked the door to the passenger compartment and used a thick cable and padlock to secure the craft to a tie-down embedded in the concrete floor. No point in taking any chances. As the light failed, we made our way across the runway toward the lighted buildings on the east end. The duffel bag dragged on my shoulders, but since I wasn't returning with Doc and Tim, I didn't want to trek back to get my things later. We didn't talk about what I'd do if no one was here. It was nearly dark by the time we reached the buildings. Lighted office spaces twinkled at the top of the buildings, but the lower levels were blank. Each door we tried was locked. Finally, the door to fourth building slid open when we approached. We looked at each other. Are they expecting someone, or is it always open? I wondered. Neither Doc nor Tim answered. The airlock circulated while we waited inside, then the internal door slid open. We stumbled into the lobby, gratefully removing our packs. I dropped my duffel bag against a wall and looked around. The lobby was empty, except for a tall desk and unoccupied chair near the internal wall. A bank of elevators stood behind the desk, but when Tim pressed a button, nothing happened. "You probably need a key," I said. I'd seen a building like this in Washington, D.C., once. Starla's dad worked there. They had guards on duty at the front desk, and her dad had to show his ID and sign us in. Then he'd used a badge to activate the elevator. For the first time, I thought about Starla without feeling intense loss or anger. It had only been a few days, so I guess my heart wasn't broken. In fact, I told myself, I'd dodged a bullet. Starla was high maintenance. "At least there's air," Tim said, sliding down the wall to sit on the floor near the desk. "And a bathroom." He pointed to a sign near the elevator. I suppose we could just stay here until someone comes in, Doc said. We could even camp here, if they don't. If the power is working, they're probably here, somewhere, I said. At that moment, the door by the elevator popped open. A tall, imposing woman strode out. She wore colorful scrubs, had her hair piled messily on top of her head, and carried a machine gun. Who are you? She demanded. Doc leaped to his feet. I'm Dr. Chris Peterson. This is Tim Cross and Zane Torres. Do you work here? I'll ask the questions, she said, not moving from her spot in the doorway. Why are you here? Doc started to answer, but I stood up. I gave the woman my best "you really want to help me because I'm hot" smile. We're sorry to bother you, but we need help. I'm a diabetic, and I need insulin. I'm down to my last few doses. If this woman had a single sympathetic bone in her body, that should sway her. Cry me a river, she said. Lots of diabetics in the world. What makes you think we have any insulin, anyway? I fished an empty vial out of my pocket. The label on this says it was made here. Her eyes narrowed and her lips thinned. Stay here. She stepped back into the stairwell and the door snapped shut. I jogged across the lobby and tried the handle, but it was locked. That went well, I said to the room at large. Cut the charm, Tim said. What? I asked. You're trying too hard. Doc nodded. I'm sure you've always been good with the ladies, but we're in a different environment now. Whether they recognize it or not, people have moved into survival mode. Being vulnerable doesn't work anymore. We need to show strength, leadership. Scrappy independence, not puppy dog eyes. No one feeds the dog when their own kids are starving. So, what do you suggest? I asked. That we demand their help? No one's going to give us anything if we're jerks. We aren't here to beg for help, Doc said. We're here to negotiate a deal. Different tactic. Hopefully, they'll come back, and we can try again. After 20 minutes or so, the door opened again. The same woman stood there, with a shorter man standing in front of her. He wore wrinkled slacks and button-down shirt, with the collar loosened. What kind of a deal? He asked. Doc shot me a warning look. We are looking for medical supplies, as my young friend suggested. We have some commodities that might be of interest to you, if you're willing to make a deal. Commodities, the man said, his face skeptical. What kind of commodities? Money is no good anymore. Doc shook his head. Not paper money. We have some precious metals. We also have the possibility of setting up a trade for food. The man looked the three of us over. You can come up. Rita, watch them. He turned and started back up the steps. Tim, Doc, and I grabbed our bags and strode across the lobby. Rita lowered her weapon as we approached, blocking the way. Guns? Doc reached into his bag and pulled out a knife and a tiny pistol. This is all I've got, he said. Tim and Zane each have a pistol as well. She looked us over again. Keep them in the bags. If I see any of you reaching for them, you're toast. She narrowed her eyes and raised the barrel of the weapon. Come on, we don't have all night, the man called back down the steps. The empty concrete stairwell echoed with our footsteps as we followed him up the stairs. Rita stayed right on my tail the whole way. The spot between my shoulder blades itched, as I imagined her gun pointed at it. When I glanced back, her weapon was angled down, but I still felt the itch. On the landing marked with a large number 3, the little man opened the door. He led us down a carpeted hallway to a glass-walled conference room. Opening the door, he ushered us in. He took a seat at the head of the table, and Rita stood by the door, her back to the solid wall at the end of the room. "I'm Joseph," he said, pointing to a pitcher and glasses clustered in the center of the table. "Have some water if you want. I think we have some snacks around her somewhere." "Joseph," Rita muttered. "We can't just give away food." He glanced back at Rita. "Sorry." She's right. My old sales instinct's kicking in. "We can't offer you any snacks." He leaned back in his chair, looking at us. "So, are you authorized to negotiate on behalf of your firm?" Doc asked, leaning in and resting his forearms on the table. Joseph laughed. "As much as anyone." "Joseph," Rita hissed, again. Joseph rolled his eyes. "Whatever, Rita. They're in the same boat we are." He turned back to us, leaning forward. "The powers that be deserted us a week or so ago. You know, the day the net crashed." "Is it back up?" I asked. Doc glared at me. "It comes and goes," Joseph said. "I think whoever is bringing it back online each time hasn't really figured out what's going on. When his first paycheck doesn't show up, that ought to clue him in." He laughed, humorlessly. "Anyway, Rita and I, and a small group of employees, are all that's left here. We have some, product in stock, that we hope to trade for." Rita coughed, interrupting Joseph. He turned and looked at her, his face exasperated. "I say let's cut the crap and put our cards on the table." "We don't know these people," Rita said in a low voice. "Maybe they have a whole army, waiting to storm the building." "If they have an army, we're toast," Joseph said. "I know this sounds odd coming from a pharmaceutical rep, but let's be transparent, okay? We might have what he wants," he nodded at me. "What have you got that we might want?" "I guess that depends on what you want," Doc countered. "What else?" "I want safety." Joseph jumped up from his seat and paced across the room to the window. "I want a place to live, clean air, and food for my wife and daughters." Tim's head popped up. "How many daughters? How old are they?" I cringed. Doc's head whipped around. "Shut up, Tim." He turned back to Joseph. "Please ignore him." That was crass. "We have a safe place. And, to be honest, we are short on females." He held up his hands. "Not that women are a commodity, but you'd be more likely to be accepted there if you brought young women with you. Unless you have some useful skills. Selling drugs won't get you in." I glanced at Rita. She stared at Doc with a kind of fire in her eyes. "How are women treated in this safe place? Are they respected? Or are they used?" Doc looked uncomfortable. "Look, I'm not in charge. If it were up to me, but it isn't. To be honest, if I had daughters, I'd probably look for somewhere else. But if you have no options other than holing up here, starving, waiting for someone to steal your product, well, you'll have to decide." "How would they get there?" I whispered to document. "No whispering." Rita barked, waving her gun. Tim looked at her. "Do you know how to use that thing?" Rita bristled. "What makes you think I don't?" Because you don't have a magazine inserted." She looked blank. Tim stood up and walked to the front of the room. "You got no bullets." He reached for the weapon. Rita jabbed it at him. "Get back." Head shaking, Tim pulled the gun away from her. He flipped it over. "Look, there's a big empty slot here. You need a magazine." It's about so big, he held one hand about 10 inches from the grip of the gun. It has a bunch of bullets slotted inside. For this model, most magazines hold 12. "Where'd you get this?" Rita's shoulders drooped. It was in the armory. The guards who normally work here took off. They left us some guns to protect ourselves, but I don't know how to use them. I've never shot anything in real life. Tim glanced back at Document. Can I help her? Doc nodded. Don't let her shoot you. As he turned back to the table, Tim and Rita headed down the hall, heads together. Where were we? Doc asked Joseph. The sales rep buried his face in his hands. We'll never survive. Doc patted him awkwardly on the shoulder. Sure, you will. You just need a little support. Look, let's talk about your inventory, and then I'll have Tim get on the ham radio. There must be somewhere around here that you can take your family. Zane's right, it's a long haul back to Tennessee. And my plane won't carry anyone else. You have a plane? Joseph's eyes widened. More like an ultralight on steroids, Doc admitted. But it can carry a lot of medical supplies. Maybe we can make some arrangements that will help us both. Chapter 15. Over the next 2 days, Doc and Joseph worked out a trade. Doc would take a load of drugs that he couldn't get anywhere else. Tim would help Joseph and the others come up with a plan to secure their stash. The production factory could, in theory, still create more drugs, but the workers had all disappeared. The few who remained couldn't operate the facility on their own. If you could recruit some folks to help you, Doc said, I could probably guarantee you customers for life. But you'd need someone to protect your facility. People are predictable. The strongest will take charge, and some of them won't care what happens to anyone else. If you try to keep this place running, you will be attacked. What if we just run it once in a while? Joseph rubbed his scruffy jaw. He'd abandoned his suit, and now wore jeans and a t-shirt like the rest of us. What do you mean? Doc asked, absently, as he packed the gallon-sized bags of pills. Louisa, one of the remaining operators, and I sat at the far end of the table opening medication boxes and removing the pills and paperwork. Then we dumped the bottles or blister packs into large plastic bags with one set of documentation in each. Doc squeezed out the air and tied them shut, shoving them into his duffel. Tim and Rita were down in the armory, training everyone else how to use the few weapons left. If I can negotiate a place for us in that T. Harris community you found, I can bring a crew down here, say, once a quarter, and we can do another run. As long as we keep the place locked up and bring a guard with us when we come down, we could have a valuable trading commodity for years. Do you have supplies for that? Doc asked. Joseph's face fell. I don't know. Louisa shook her head. We got about a month's raw materials. She shrugged. Maybe more for some products. I think you should secure your place up in T. Harris, Doc said. Take a sample with you. Then, when you're in, you can give them the rest. If they have the manpower, you can come back down and run the factory until you run out of raw materials. Louisa nodded. That's what I was thinking. And maybe we take as much as we can carry and stash it somewhere else. So we have leverage. So they don't just take what we got and run. Ow. I sucked on my finger. Paper cut. They all nodded, sympathetically. We'd been ripping packages open for 2 days straight, and we all had countless paper cuts. Tim and Rita came in. We found a small truck with solar panels. It should get us to T. Harris. Us? Doc asked. Tim nodded. I'm staying with Rita. Rita smiled, her hand on Tim's arm. We'll get everyone up to T. Harris. If we approach as a group, with valuable skills and trade items, they should take us in. Doc smiled. I'll be sorry to leave you behind, Tim. These folks are lucky to have you. You aren't kidding, Rita said. That truck was here because it didn't work. Tim fixed it. Tim shrugged, his face turning red. And that gives me more room in the plane for drugs, Doc said. Unless someone wants to come back with me? Sorry, Zane, not you. He grinned, wryly. I held up my hands. I don't want to go back. No offense. I still need to figure out a long-term plan for my insulin. The load you all gave me, I smiled around the room in general, will only last a year or so. I think it's made from pigs, Louisa said. But we don't have any pigs, so there you go. Ours was synthetic. I wouldn't know how to make the stuff, anyway. I only run the encapsulator. Doc left later that day, with 4 duffel bags full of drugs. In exchange, he'd given Joseph 2 more weapons, some gold, and a promise of a food delivery in the fall. You can trust Doc, Tim said. We went down to the lobby to see him off. Tim used the little truck to drive us to the hangar, where we helped him load. We watched his plane climb into the sky overhead an hour later. Is he going to be okay on his own? I asked. Tim nodded. He's stopping at the safe house. He'll radio to tell us when he lands and leaves. Tim's ham radio skills came in handy. When Doc got home, he gave us a status update, and I even got a chance to talk to Master Stevens for a few minutes. After that, we arranged to keep in touch with a weekly radio call. A couple weeks after Doc left, we got a message from the ranch in Tijeras. Doc had located them before he left, and Tim had radioed a request to join their community. Then he and Rita had driven up with a sample of their trade items. Apparently, the group did everything democratically, and making a decision of this magnitude, admitting a dozen new people, took a while. But one afternoon, the message arrived. We were in. We'd packed the remaining supplies of medication into some large crates. Half of them, Tim and Rita hid in an abandoned military storage facility up in the mountains. Rita had heard about it as a child, but it had taken the 2 of them the better part of the last 3 weeks to locate and get into. Tim had fitted a new lock on the door, and they'd moved our stash up into the hills. Closer to Tijeras, anyway. That afternoon, we gathered in the conference room to make final plans. We sat there, finishing off the last of the food we'd scavenged from the vending machines. I'm still not sure this is the best option for me, I said. They never answered our question about diabetics. And there hasn't been enough net access for me to find any info on how to make insulin. I wonder if I should try somewhere else. Where would you go? Rita asked. It's not like there are a bunch of refuges advertising free insulin. I know. I shook my head. By the time your supply runs out, we'll have figured it out. Joseph said. Maybe you use Tijeras as a base and explore other options from there. We'd had this conversation a million times. The intruder alert buzzer sounded. Rita and Joseph jumped. Crap, Rita said. You didn't send anyone outside, did you, Tim? Tim, already across the room at a computer monitor, shook his head. Someone is in the lobby, Rita said, peeking over his shoulder. We all crowded around the monitor. An older man with graying hair stood in the middle of the lobby. He wore faded jeans and a worn plaid shirt. His face was lined, but he looked healthy and fit. 2 younger men, each carrying a rifle and a holstered pistol, stood behind him, one watching through the airlock, the other scanning the room. Hello, the older man called. Anyone here? Tim glanced at Rita. She nodded. Let's go down. Tim pushed a few buttons on the computer. Ollie, I need a team to meet us on the 2nd floor. Louisa, Joseph and I lingered by the screen, watching the confrontation. Rita and Tim had refined their reception plan over the weeks since we'd arrived. 5 armed men and women wearing bulletproof vests trooped out of the stairwell. They didn't raise their weapons but took up stations on either side of the door. Tim and Rita followed them down the steps. "Hi, I'm Rita," the tall woman said, stepping into the lobby. "This is Tim. Can we help you?" The 2 men with guns swung their weapons toward Rita and her armed guard. "No need for that," Tim said, his own pointed straight at the old man. "State your business." "Gentlemen," the older guy said to his guard. "At ease." The 2 younger guys lowered their guns, and Tim pointed his at the floor. Behind him, the guard relaxed a fraction. "I am Dr. David Morton," the man said. "I represent the Roth Institute in Arizona. We are in search of medical supplies. Rumor pointed us here. Are you alone here?" "Like I'd tell you that," Tim said. "You got something to trade?" "We have access to food, seeds, fertilizer," Morton said. "Advanced medical care if anyone requires it. We have a list of items we'd like to acquire. This is the whole list, so disregard anything that doesn't apply to you." He held out a sheaf of papers. Rita and Tim exchanged looks. "We have a weapons storage box here," Tim said, walking across the room to the tall counter. He had installed a small office safe he'd found upstairs. "If you'd like to come in and talk with us, you'll need to leave the firepower here." "How do we know you won't just kill us and steal our stuff?" one of the younger men asked. Rita shrugged. "I guess you don't. But you won't get inside with your gun. Your choice." She turned away. "Wait," Dr. Morton said. He turned to his guard. "Ernie, you stay here. Bill, leave your weapons with Ernie and come with me." He looked at Rita. "May we can keep our radios?" He held up a walkie-talkie. "Of course." Rita led the way into the stairwell. 2 of Tim's troop remained behind in the lobby, staying by the door. They stared at Ernie, alone on the far side. "I wonder how long before they get in a fight?" Joseph asked. I shook my head. "Our guys are well trained, now. They won't start anything. And that Ernie is on his own. He's going to be careful." Behind us, the conference room door opened. We turned to greet the newcomers. Rita walked in, followed by Dr. Morton and Bill, Tim bringing up the rear. The rest of our folks stayed out in the hallway. Tim glanced back and waved them off. They trotted away. Morton handed Rita the sheaf of papers. "If you have any of these items, we'd like to discuss a trade." Rita took the papers, paging through them. "We might have some of this stuff. What have you got to offer?" "We can bring you food, if you need it, with a guarantee of more later. We have some manufacturing facilities, so if there are other products you require, we might be able to fabricate them." Morton pointed to the pages. "The start items are most important to us." Joseph snickered, and I raised an eyebrow. "Shouldn't have shown their hand that way," he whispered. I rolled my eyes. "You're the one who said it's easier if everyone is transparent." "We'll see." Rita turned around and glared at Joseph. Then she looked at Louisa. "Lou, could you get a list of the items we have available for trade? Nothing we've already promised to, other parties." She smiled at Morton as Louisa headed out the door. "We have some other trading partners." "Of course." Morton paused. "How many folks do you have here? Do you have long-term plans? My understanding is you have internal power sources, but do you have food production capabilities?" "We aren't staying here," Rita said. "These buildings have solar, wind, and geothermal power, but you're right. We have no way to grow food. We debated installing some kind of hydroponics, but we've decided it's better to just move." This building isn't really defendable. Why are you telling him this? Joseph demanded. Don't give away our weaknesses. Rita stared him down. If we were planning on staying here, I would be more cautious. But, if they wanted to steal from us, they would have just attacked. And, they're welcome to our building, after we leave. Morton held up a hand. We have no need of your building. Although, if you're leaving, we might scavenge some things. We just want to acquire the items we need. And, if you don't have a safe place to go, we have room for carefully vetted personnel. Joseph narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? What kind of place? We have a dome, Morton said. A fully contained facility that can house and provide for many people. Rita smiled. We have some place to go. But thank you for the offer. I think we can come to some arrangements. Rita, Joseph, and Dr. Morton talked for hours, bartering over medical supplies and equipment. Tim and Bill went down to bring Ernie upstairs. We all shared the remains of the vending food. Bill went back out to their truck and brought in some food, too. Louisa and I brought items in as the trades were agreed and confirmed. By late afternoon, they had quite a stack of boxes in the corner near the door. Oh, one more thing. Do you have any syringes? Morton asked. That's one thing we have lots of. I don't know why they had so many crates of them in the basement, but they're down there. Probably been there for years. It's not like they go bad. Once he was convinced to help, Joseph was all in. What kind do you need? A size appropriate for insulin, Morton said. My head popped up. Insulin? I asked. Do you have a diabetic? We have two, actually. Morton gave me a considering look. We have resources to produce insulin, but the equipment to administer is harder to come by. We can't produce a version that is compatible with the pumps. You can make insulin? My heart clenched, hope and fear gripping each other. Tell me more about this dome. Morton's lips quirked up. The Roth Institute is a fully self-contained underground facility. We have air filters, solar, geothermal and wind power, agricultural and manufacturing. There are apartments for families, and dormitories for solo residents. Up-to-date medical care. Educational facilities. He glanced at Bill and Ernie. Anything to add? Movies. Library. Swimming pool. Bill said. It's safe, Ernie said. You got enough girls? Tim asked. Rita smacked him. He smiled and shook his head. I'm not asking for me. I got you. I broke in. I'd like to hear the answer, too. If he answered that question the way Leah and her crew had, I'd know I needed to keep looking. Morton gave me a stern look. We focus on helping as many people survive as possible, regardless of gender or any other protected status. We care about character. We'll be living in close quarters for many years to come. I can't guarantee you'll get in. We do a thorough background check. We downloaded the latest copies of the international database just days before the net went down. We will check. My record is clean, I said. I'll take the chance. Morton had me fill out an application on a tablet he'd brought and conducted a short interview. I'm pretty handy with a computer, I said. I used to be a bit of a hacker. Morton gave me a considering look. You didn't put that on the application. Yeah, I didn't think hacker looked very good. I put my other computer experience on there. Morton nodded. I read it. As I said, when we get back to the dome, we'll run it through our standard security check. Unless we find something incriminating, you're in. I'm a pretty good judge of character. It's one of the reasons they send me. And the others gave you good reviews. But if there's anything, let's say, unsavory, you should disclose it now. I thought for a minute. I have a VidTube channel. I wouldn't say it was unsavory, but maybe it wasn't in the best taste at times. Morton nodded. Typical teen stuff, I'm sure. Maybe instead of hacker you should say network specialist. He handed the tablet back to me. List anything else, any other skills you might have. Did you do any weapons training with Tim, for example? Oh, yeah. I noted that on the appropriate line. I'm also a black belt in Taekwondo. Morton tapped the device. Put it down. Tim, Rita, Joseph, Louisa, and the rest left for the ranch the next morning. They took a good portion of the food Morton carried in the back of his truck as a goodwill offering to the Tijeras folks. Joseph and several of the others had private vehicles, so they formed a little convoy heading up into the mountains. Saying goodbye was harder than I expected. I'd known these folks for less than a month, but we'd gotten close. After they disappeared up the road, Bill, Ernie, Morton, and I loaded the supplies they'd negotiated into their truck. They'd dismantled some of the building's power equipment, and we loaded it into the truck as well. We also took several computers. We drove for hours, stopping along the way at rest stops. Some of them had independent power and still operated, but others were just empty warehouses. We didn't meet many people. Since Albuquerque had been evacuated, there weren't a lot of folks between there and Phoenix. The few we saw slunk away off the highway before we could get within speaking distance. Finally, as twilight fell, we turned off the highway and crossed the desert, headed toward a towering, flat-topped mesa. As we approached the cliff, we passed plastic air-pressured tents and temporary structures. People wearing packs huddled together, staring at us as we drove by, but no one tried to stop us. Past the tents, we approached a clump of dark, blocky buildings. In the dim light, a ghostly blue flickered over the roofs. The road narrowed and descended between concrete walls, dead-ending against a vast, featureless wall that towered several stories above us. Bill, who had driven the last leg, stopped the truck a few feet from the wall, but left the engine running. He tapped on the touch screen of the dashboard and leaned back in his seat. In a few seconds, a face appeared on the screen. "Hey, Bill." The dark-haired woman smiled. "Ernie. Dr. M. Good to see you back. I show 4 people in the truck. Who's the stowaway?" The 2 men looked at Dr. Morton, then at me. Morton leaned back and pushed me forward a little. "This is Zane Torres. I've got his application, and we'll need to run him through the usual checks. But I want to bring him inside for processing. He brought a weapon. Bill has secured it. I believe he'll be an asset to our team." "Good to hear, Dr. M." The woman smiled again. "Mr. Torres, welcome to the Dome."
Thanks for listening to Abandoned World. If you'd like to find out what happens to Zane after he gets to the Dome, read Recycled World. For more information about that book, and all my other science fiction, go to juliahuney.com.